The chains around Elena's wrists were cold enough to burn. She did not cry out. She would not give them the satisfaction. Around her, the war camp of the Blackthorn pack buzzed with the low growls of victorious wolves, torches throwing long shadows across the trampled grass, and somewhere behind her, what remained of her own pack's warriors knelt in defeat, their heads bowed, their howls silenced. She had fought. She remembered that much clearly. She remembered the moment a warrior twice her size had pinned her to the ground and pressed a blade to her throat, and she remembered thinking that this was how it would end, in mud and smoke, far from home. But death had not come. Instead, rough hands had dragged her forward, past rows of broken shields and fallen banners, toward a raised platform where the Alpha King of the Blackthorn pack stood waiting. She had heard of him before. Everyone had. Alpha King Damian Blackthorn was spoken about in whispers even among his enemies, a name that made grown warriors lower their eyes. He was said to be a man without mercy, a king who had clawed his way to power over the bodies of anyone foolish enough to stand against him, and who ruled his territory with a grip so tight that even his own council did not dare question him twice. Elena had expected many things when she was finally brought before him. She had expected cruelty. She had expected to be paraded as a trophy of war, proof that her pack had been crushed beneath his boot. What she had not expected was the way the world seemed to tilt the moment his eyes found hers. It happened in an instant, the way lightning splits a sky that had been calm only a heartbeat before. Damian had been mid-sentence, giving some order to a warrior at his side, his voice flat and commanding, when his gaze slid toward the prisoners being marched forward. It landed on Elena, and everything in him went still. The bond snapped into place between them, like an invisible rope pulled taut, and Elena felt it too, a pull so sudden and so powerful that her knees nearly buckled. She had heard stories of the mate bond her entire life, how it was said to feel like coming home, like finding the missing half of your own soul. She had never imagined it would feel like this, like being struck by something she had no way to defend against, in front of an enemy who held her fate in his hands. Damian's jaw tightened. For one long moment, he simply stared at her, and Elena watched something flicker behind his eyes, something raw and unguarded, before it vanished completely, replaced by a coldness so absolute it made her shiver. "Take her to the East Tower," he said, his voice carrying across the camp, without rising in volume at all. "She is not to be harmed. She is also not to be treated as a guest." A murmur rippled through the gathered warriors. Elena saw the confusion on their faces, saw a few exchange glances they thought she would not notice. No one questioned an order from the Alpha King, but everyone in that camp understood what had just happened. They had all felt the shift in the air. They all knew what it meant when an Alpha's eyes locked onto someone and refused to let go. Elena lifted her chin, refusing to let her fear show. "I am not yours to command," she said, her voice steady, despite the chains biting into her skin. "Bond or no bond, I belong to no one." Something like amusement crossed Damian's face, though it never reached his eyes. "You belong to whoever holds the chains," he said. "For now, that happens to be me." He turned away from her then, as if the conversation were already finished, as if the bond that had just torn through both of them meant nothing at all. Elena watched his back as the guards pulled her toward the tower, and she told herself that she did not care, that whatever pull she felt toward this cruel king was nothing more than an unfortunate trick of nature, something she would learn to ignore. The East Tower was not what she expected. She had imagined a dungeon, something dark and damp, built for punishment. Instead, she found herself in a round stone room at the top of a narrow staircase, furnished simply but not without comfort. A bed against one wall, a small table, a window that looked out over the vast Blackthorn territory, forests stretching to the horizon in every direction. It was, in its own way, beautiful. It was also, unmistakably, a cage. The door was heavy oak, reinforced with iron, and when it closed behind her, she heard the distinct sound of a lock turning from the outside. She crossed to the window immediately, testing the bars that had been fitted into the stone, cold iron, that did not budge no matter how hard she pulled. Below, she could see guards positioned at regular intervals around the tower's base, their eyes trained upward even from this distance. She was a prisoner in every sense of the word, and the man who held her captive was also, according to nature itself, the other half of her soul. Elena sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself exactly one moment of despair, one moment to feel the full weight of everything that had happened, the loss of her pack, the uncertainty of her future, the terrible unfairness of a bond that had chosen her worst enemy as her match. Then she stood, straightened her spine, and decided that despair was a luxury she could not afford. Days passed slowly in the tower. A servant brought her meals twice a day, a young woman named Clara who never met Elena's eyes, and never spoke more than was necessary. Elena tried, gently, to draw her into conversation, asking about the pack, about the territory, about anything that might help her understand the world she had been thrown into. But Clara always shook her head and hurried from the room, as though speaking too freely might cost her something dear. It was on the 5th day that Damien came to see her for the first time since her capture. Elena heard the lock turn and rose from where she had been sitting by the window, watching the sun set over the trees. When the door opened, Damien filled the frame, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb the last of the daylight. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, though he did not lock it, and for a moment the two of them simply looked at each other. "You look well," he said finally, his tone giving nothing away. "I am a prisoner in a tower," Elena replied. "I would hardly call that well. You have a bed, you have food, you have not been harmed." He crossed the room slowly, his movements deliberate, and stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that Elena could feel the pull of the bond humming between them, insistent and unwanted. "Many prisoners of war are given far less." "I am not a prisoner of war," Elena said. "I am your mate. Whether you like it or not, that is what the bond has decided. And you have locked me in a tower as though I am a threat to be contained." Something flickered across his face again, that same brief crack in his composure she had seen in the war camp, gone almost before she could be certain she had seen it at all. "You are a threat," he said quietly. "Everything about this is a threat. Your pack has been at war with mine for 3 generations. Your blood is enemy blood, and now nature has decided to bind me to you, as though that history means nothing." "It was not my choice either," Elena said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I wanted to feel drawn to the man who conquered my people, who holds me prisoner in his territory?" Damien's expression hardened, and for a moment, Elena thought she had pushed too far, that he would turn and leave without another word. Instead, he stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. "I did not ask for a mate," he said, his voice low and rough. "I built this kingdom with my own hands. I do not need a weakness that enemies can use against me. I do not need a bond that makes me vulnerable to a woman whose people would see me dead." "Then release me," Elena said. "Send me back to what remains of my pack. Let the bond fade, or ignore it, or do whatever it is you think will make this easier. But do not keep me locked in a tower like an animal." "I cannot release you," Damien said, and something in his voice told Elena that this, at least, was the truth. "Not now. Not with my council watching. Not with the war barely finished. If I let you go, they will see it as weakness. If I claim you as my queen, they will see it as betrayal, a king bound to the blood of his enemies. There is no path forward that does not end in disaster, Elena." It was the first time he had said her name, and hearing it in his voice did something strange to her chest, a small, unwelcome warmth that she immediately tried to smother. "So your solution is to lock me away and pretend I do not exist," she said. "My solution," Damien said, "is to keep you alive, while I decide what to do with a situation that should never have happened." He turned then, and walked to the door, his hand resting on the iron handle for a long moment before he spoke again, without turning back to look at her. "You will remain here. You will be fed, and you will be safe. And that is more than I owe you. Do not mistake my restraint for kindness." The door closed behind him, and Elena heard the lock turn once more. She stood in the center of the room for a long time afterward, staring at the closed door, trying to understand the strange mixture of anger and confusion swirling inside her. He was cruel, there was no question of that. He had imprisoned her without cause beyond fear, had spoken to her as though her feelings meant nothing, had made clear that he saw the bond between them as a burden rather than a gift. And yet, beneath all of that coldness, she had seen something else, something he was trying very hard to hide, a crack in the armor. a flicker of the same pull she felt whenever he was near. She did not know what to do with that knowledge. She was not sure it changed anything. A king who imprisoned his mate out of fear was still a king who imprisoned his mate, regardless of what softness might be buried underneath the cruelty. Over the following weeks, Elena settled into a strange, quiet routine. Clara brought her meals and, slowly, began to speak a little more freely, offering small pieces of information about life beyond the tower walls. Elena learned that the war between the two packs had raged for generations, sparked by a dispute over territory so old that most had forgotten the original cause. She learned that Damien had become Alpha King young, after his father's sudden death, and had spent every year since proving to his council and his pack that he was strong enough to hold the throne. She learned that his council was made up of powerful, ambitious wolves who did not take kindly to anything that threatened the stability of the kingdom they had helped build. She also learned, though Clara never said it directly, that the servants in the palace whispered about her, about the mate bond the Alpha King refused to acknowledge, about the prisoner in the East Tower who might, in another life, have been their queen. Elena spent her days watching the forest from her window, memorizing the patterns of the guards below, searching for any weakness in her prison that might offer a chance at escape. She found none. The tower had been built, she began to realize, specifically to hold someone exactly like her, someone strong enough to be dangerous, and important enough to require careful containment. Damien visited twice more over the following month, each time brief, each time tense. He asked no questions about her well-being beyond the barest formality, and she offered him no warmth in return, though she could not deny that each visit left her thinking about him long after he had gone, replaying his words, trying to understand the man beneath the crown. It was during his third visit that Elena noticed something had changed in him, something subtle but undeniable. He seemed distracted, his usual sharp focus dulled by something clearly weighing on his mind. When she asked what was wrong, he simply shook his head and changed the subject, but Elena had spent enough time studying people to know when someone was hiding something. She did not know, not yet, what secrets Damien carried behind his cold exterior. She did not know how deeply the war between their packs had scarred him, or what fears drove him to keep her locked away rather than claim her openly as his queen. All she knew was that the bond between them refused to fade, no matter how much either of them wished it would, and that somewhere beneath the ice of his composure, something was beginning, slowly and reluctantly, to thaw. She had no way of knowing, sitting alone in her tower room as autumn began to color the forest beyond her window, that she was already carrying a secret of her own, one that would soon make it impossible for either of them to keep pretending that the bond between them did not exist. For now, she simply watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and red, and wondered what kind of future, if any, awaited a queen who had been made a prisoner before she had ever worn a crown. One afternoon, while Clara was clearing away the remains of her lunch, Elena noticed a different guard standing watch near the tower entrance below, a man with dark hair and a calm, steady presence that seemed out of place among the usual harsh-faced soldiers. When Clara returned the next day, Elena asked about him. "That is Caleb," Clara said, lowering her voice even though no one else was in the room. "He is the Alpha King's beta, second in command of the entire pack. It is unusual for him to stand guard duty himself." "Why would he do that?" Elena asked. Clara hesitated, glancing toward the door as though worried someone might be listening. "I could not say for certain, but there are those in the palace who do not agree with how you have been treated. Perhaps he is one of them." The idea took root in Elena's mind and would not let go. A powerful figure within the pack who might see her differently than the council did was not nothing. It was, perhaps, the first thread of hope she had found since her capture. 2 days later, when Elena was allowed her brief hour of exercise in the small enclosed courtyard behind the tower, she found Caleb standing near the gate, his arms crossed, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "You are the one they call Caleb," she said, testing the waters carefully. She had learned enough of palace life by then to know that trust was a rare and dangerous thing to offer freely. "I am," he said, "and you are the reason half the council has not slept properly in weeks." Despite herself, Elena felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. "I did not realize I held that much power from inside a locked tower." Caleb studied her for a long moment, and something in his gaze softened. You underestimate what it means for a mate bond to appear during wartime, he said. The pack feels it too, in ways you might not expect. There is a kind of unrest that comes from an alpha denying his own bond. Wolves are creatures of instinct. We know when something is wrong, even if we cannot always name it. Then perhaps you can explain to me why your alpha insists on treating me as an enemy, rather than what nature has decided I am, Elena said, unable to keep the frustration from her voice. Caleb's expression grew serious. Damien has spent his entire life proving that he cannot be broken, he said. His father was killed by wolves from a rival pack when Damien was barely more than a boy, and he was forced to take the throne before he was ready, surrounded by counselors who doubted he would survive his first year as alpha. He learned early that showing weakness is the fastest way to lose everything. A mate, in his mind, is the greatest weakness a king can have, someone his enemies can use against him, someone who could be taken, hurt, or turned into a hostage in another war. Elena absorbed this in silence, feeling something shift inside her chest, a small crack of understanding forming where before there had only been anger. It did not excuse Damien's cruelty, but it began, slowly, to explain it. That does not mean locking me away is right, she said finally. No, Caleb agreed. It does not. But I have known Damien since we were pups together, long before either of us understood what it meant to carry the weight of a crown. And I can tell you this much. He has not been the same since the day he saw you in that war camp. Whatever he tells himself, whatever excuses he gives his counsel, the bond is already changing him. He simply has not admitted it yet, not even to himself. Their conversation was cut short by the arrival of another guard, and Caleb straightened immediately, his easy manner replaced by the disciplined bearing of a soldier on duty. But before he turned away, he offered Elena one final piece of advice, spoken so quietly she almost missed it. Be patient, he said. Ice does not melt all at once, but it does melt. Elena carried those words with her back to her tower room, turning them over in her mind long after the sun had set. She was not naive enough to believe that patience alone would free her from her prison, or that a few kind words from a sympathetic beta would undo weeks of imprisonment and cruelty. But for the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to feel something other than despair. A small, cautious flicker of hope, fragile as a candle flame in the wind, but present all the same. Days later, her patience was tested in an entirely different way. She woke one morning feeling unusually tired, a heaviness in her limbs that no amount of rest seemed to ease. When Clara brought her breakfast, the smell of the food, normally something Elena looked forward to after long, empty hours alone, turned her stomach so violently that she had to turn away, pressing a hand to her mouth. Clara set the tray down with a concerned frown. Are you unwell? I am fine, Elena said quickly, though she was not entirely certain that was true. Simply tired. It has been a difficult few weeks. But the tiredness did not pass, and over the following days, Elena began to notice other small changes, a sensitivity to smells that had never bothered her before, a strange fluttering awareness low in her body that she could not quite explain. She said nothing to Clara, and certainly nothing to Damien during his increasingly rare visits, keeping her observations locked away in the same careful silence she used to guard everything else about herself in this place. She told herself it was simply the stress of captivity finally taking its toll on her body. She told herself many things over those following weeks, reasons and explanations, that felt increasingly thin each time she repeated them to herself in the quiet darkness of her tower room. Deep down, in the part of herself she was not yet ready to fully acknowledge, Elena already suspected the truth. And she understood, with a growing sense of dread, that whatever was happening within her would change everything. For herself, for Damien, and for the fragile, unspoken bond that neither of them had yet found the courage to name. The nights were the hardest. In the darkness of the tower, with nothing to distract her from her own thoughts, Elena often found herself reaching for the bond without meaning to, feeling for the faint, distant presence of the man who was supposed to be her other half. She hated herself a little for it, hated the way her body and her instincts betrayed her better judgment, pulling her toward a man who had shown her nothing but coldness since the day they met. But she was not without hope. Elena had survived the fall of her pack. She had survived capture and imprisonment. She had looked into the eyes of the man who called himself her enemy, and refused to look away. Whatever came next, Whatever cruel twists her fate still had in store, she intended to face them the same way she had faced everything else in her life, with her chin held high and her spirit unbroken. Outside her window, the forest whispered in the wind, ancient and indifferent to the small, fierce battle being fought within the walls of the East Tower, a battle not of swords or claws, but of two stubborn hearts refusing to admit what the bond between them had already decided. Elena pressed a hand against her stomach in the dim light of early morning, staring at the ceiling of her tower room, finally allowing herself to admit what she had suspected for weeks. She was carrying a child. Not one child, her instincts told her, but two, a certainty that settled into her bones the way only a mother's knowledge could, without need for confirmation from any healer. The realization brought with it a wave of emotions so overwhelming that she had to sit up and press her palms against her eyes to keep from crying out. Fear came first, sharp and immediate. She was a prisoner in enemy territory, carrying the children of a king who had shown her nothing but coldness and suspicion since the moment they met. If Damien saw these children as she feared he might, not as a gift but as a complication, a weapon his enemies could use, a burden his council would resent, then her babies would be in danger from the moment they were born. Beneath the fear, though, something else stirred, something warmer and more fierce. These were her children. Whatever cruelty their father had shown her, whatever uncertainty lay ahead, Elena felt a protective instinct rise in her chest, so powerful, it nearly stole her breath. She would guard these children with everything she had, against Damien's counsel, against the war that still simmered beneath the surface of an uneasy peace, against anyone who dared to see them as anything less than precious. She made her decision before the sun had fully risen. She would tell no one. Not Clara, whose loyalty she still could not fully measure. Not Caleb, kind as he had been, whose first duty remained to his alpha king. And certainly not Damien, who had made it painfully clear that he saw their bond as a burden rather than a blessing. Elena would carry this secret alone for as long as she possibly could, buying time to understand her situation more fully, before revealing something that could not be taken back. It was a decision easier made than kept. As the weeks passed, Elena found herself growing more tired, more prone to sudden waves of nausea that she had to hide behind carefully timed excuses and turned faces. Clara, sharp-eyed despite her quiet nature, began to look at her with a growing suspicion that Elena tried desperately to deflect. "You have not been eating well," Clara observed one afternoon, setting down a tray that Elena had barely touched the day before. "And you grow pale some mornings, then flushed by evening. Are you certain you are well?" "The tower does strange things to a person's appetite," Elena said, forcing a light tone into her voice. "I am not accustomed to being confined. It affects the body in unexpected ways." Clara studied her for a long moment, and Elena thought, with a flicker of alarm, that the young servant might press further. Instead, Clara simply nodded and changed the subject, though Elena noticed the way her eyes lingered a moment too long before she left the room. Damien's visits had grown even less frequent in the weeks since Elena's realization, and for that, at least, she was grateful. Each time he came, she found it harder to maintain her composure, harder to hide the changes happening within her body, and harder still to ignore the way the bond between them seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, as though her pregnancy had somehow deepened a connection neither of them had asked for. When he did visit, nearly a month after she had first suspected the truth, Elena steeled herself carefully before he entered, arranging herself by the window with her back partially turned, hoping the angle would hide whatever changes might have become visible in her figure. "You seem distant," Damien said, after a long silence had stretched between them. He remained near the door, as he often did, as though keeping physical distance might somehow lessen the pull of the bond. "More than usual." "I am a prisoner," Elena said, not turning to look at him. "Distance seems a reasonable response to captivity." "That is not what I meant." Damien's voice carried an edge of something Elena could not quite name, frustration perhaps, or something closer to concern that he would never openly admit to feeling. "You have barely spoken more than a few words to me in weeks. Even for you, that is unusual." Elena finally turned to face him, keeping her arms carefully crossed over her middle. "What would you have me say? That I have grown to enjoy my captivity? That I have found peace with being locked away like something dangerous, something my own mate cannot bear to look at without a locked door and armed guards between us?" Something flickered across Damien's face, and for a moment, Elena thought he might actually respond honestly, might finally let down some piece of the wall he had built so carefully around himself. Instead, his expression hardened, and he took a step back toward the door. "I did not come here to argue," he said. "I came to inform you that the council has requested a meeting regarding your continued presence in the tower. Some among them believe it is time to decide, permanently, what is to be done with you." Elena's heart went cold, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun streaming through her window. "What does that mean?" "It means," Damien said, his jaw tight, "that some of my counselors believe a prisoner, tied by blood to an enemy pack, bonded or not, represents a risk too great to be allowed to continue indefinitely. There have been suggestions made that I find difficult to ignore given the political reality of our situation." The implication hung heavy in the air between them, and Elena felt her pulse quicken, both from fear for herself and, more powerfully, from fear for the children she carried, children that no one else in this palace yet knew existed. If the council discovered her pregnancy before she found a way to protect herself and her babies, she had no doubt they would see it as precisely the kind of complication that justified whatever cruel solution they might already be considering. "And what do you believe?" she asked, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the trembling she felt beginning in her hands. "You are the Alpha King. Their suggestions carry no weight unless you allow them to." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her, somewhere in the trees visible through her window. "I believe," he said finally, "that I have spent every day since your capture trying to find a solution that does not end in disaster. For you, for me, for this entire kingdom. I believe my council grows impatient with my hesitation, and I believe that impatience is becoming dangerous." "Then protect me," Elena said, the words leaving her before she could stop them, raw and honest, in a way she had rarely allowed herself to be in his presence. "If you believe I do not deserve whatever fate your council is imagining, then stand against them. You are their king." "It is not that simple," Damien said, frustration bleeding into his voice for the first time since he had entered the room. "Every decision I make is watched, weighed, judged by wolves who have spent their entire lives building alliances and expectations around the stability of this throne. If I protect you without explanation, without justification they can accept, I hand them exactly the kind of weakness they have been waiting for since the day you arrived." "Then give them an explanation," Elena said, her frustration rising to match his own. "Tell them the truth. Tell them what the bond means, what it has always meant for wolves like us. Or is the great Alpha King too proud to admit that nature has chosen someone he considers beneath him?" The words struck harder than Elena had intended, and she watched something shift behind Damien's eyes, a flash of anger quickly followed by something that looked almost like pain. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with everything unsaid. "You do not understand what is at stake," Damien said finally, his voice quieter now, though no less intense. "You did not grow up watching your father hold together a fragile peace through sheer force of will. You did not watch him die at the hands of wolves, who saw any softness as an invitation to attack. I have spent my entire reign proving that I am not vulnerable, that this pack cannot be shaken by anything, including matters of the heart. I cannot simply set that aside, because nature has decided to complicate my life." "Complicate," Elena repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. "Is that what I am to you? A complication?" Damien did not answer immediately, and in his silence, Elena felt something inside her harden, a protective wall rising to shield not just herself, but the secret she carried, the children who deserved better than a father too consumed by pride and fear to claim them openly. "I think you should leave," she said quietly, turning back toward the window before he could see whatever emotion might be showing on her face. For a moment, she thought he might argue, might push past her request, the way he had pushed past so many of her boundaries since her capture. Instead, she heard the sound of his footsteps retreating, followed by the click of the door closing, and the familiar, hated sound of the lock turning once more. Elena remained by the window long after he had gone, watching the sun sink slowly behind the distant trees, her hand resting protectively over her middle. Whatever came next, whatever the council decided, whatever cruel choices Damien continued to make in the name of protecting his throne, Elena understood with sudden, absolute clarity that she could no longer afford to wait passively for someone else to determine her fate. She had survived the fall of her pack. She had survived weeks of imprisonment in a cold stone tower, and now, carrying 2 lives that depended entirely on her strength and her resolve, she intended to survive whatever came next as well, with or without the help of a king too afraid of his own counsel to claim the family that fate had given him. That night, as she lay awake listening to the distant call of wolves somewhere beyond the palace walls, Elena began, for the first time since her capture, to think seriously about escape, not out of anger, and not simply out of fear, but out of a fierce, unshakable determination to give her children a chance at safety that this tower, and this king, seemed increasingly unlikely to provide. The following morning, when Clara arrived with breakfast, Elena found herself studying the young woman more carefully than she had before, weighing whether there might be some way to earn her trust, some path toward an ally within the palace walls beyond the beta whose loyalty ultimately belonged to Damien. "You seem troubled," Clara said, setting the tray down with the same quiet efficiency she always showed. "The council wishes to discuss my fate," Elena said, deciding that honesty, carefully measured, might serve her better than continued secrecy. "I do not imagine their conclusions will favor me." Clara's hands stilled over the tray, and for a moment, her carefully guarded expression slipped, revealing something that looked almost like sympathy. "The council has never favored anyone who threatens the balance of power within this palace," she said quietly. "It is not personal, though I imagine it feels that way." "Does that make it easier to accept?" Elena asked, unable to keep a note of bitterness from her voice. "No," Clara admitted, "it does not." She hesitated, glancing toward the door as she always did, before speaking too freely, then lowered her voice further still. "My mother served in this palace before me. She used to tell me stories about the old queen, King Damien's mother, who was said to be gentle and wise, and who was often overruled by counselors who believed strength meant cruelty. She died when Damien was still young, before she could ever soften the harder edges his father's advisors tried to carve into him." Elena absorbed this new piece of the puzzle in silence, feeling the shape of Damien's history growing clearer with each fragment she gathered. A father lost to enemy violence, a mother's gentleness dismissed and eventually lost entirely, a council that had spent decades shaping a boy into precisely the kind of unyielding king they believed the pack required to survive. It did not excuse his cruelty, but it painted a fuller picture of the man who had locked her away, rather than risk the vulnerability of claiming her. "Thank you for telling me this," Elena said. "I know it is not without risk, sharing such things with a prisoner." Clara offered a small, tight smile. "You are not simply a prisoner, my lady. Whatever the council chooses to call you, whatever else is true, the bond does not lie. Many of us in the palace have begun to hope, quietly, that our king might yet find the courage to see what the rest of us have already recognized." After Clara left, Elena found herself turning the conversation over in her mind for hours, searching for some thread of hope within it, some indication that the situation was not as hopeless as it sometimes felt within the confines of her tower room. If even the palace servants, who had far more reason to fear the council's displeasure than open sympathy for a prisoner, had begun to see her as something more than an enemy to be contained, then perhaps Damien's resistance was not as absolute as he wished everyone, including himself, to believe. But hope, Elena reminded herself firmly, was not a strategy. She could not simply wait for sentiment among the servants to somehow shift the will of a council determined to see her as a threat. She needed a plan, something concrete, something that did not depend on the goodwill of a king too consumed by pride and old wounds to act in her defense. Over the following days, Elena began quietly mapping every detail of her prison that she could observe from her window, and during her brief hours of exercise in the courtyard. She noted the guard rotations, the times when the tower seemed least watched, the paths that led away from the palace grounds toward the dense forest beyond. She had no illusions about the difficulty of what she was considering. Escaping while pregnant, without allies, without resources, deep within enemy territory, was a plan built more on desperation than any real confidence of success. But desperation, she had learned since her capture, was often the mother of courage that circumstances alone could never inspire. She did not share her growing plans with Clara, unwilling to place the young woman in danger should anything go wrong, and she certainly did not share them with Caleb during the brief, quiet conversations they continued to share whenever his duties brought him near her tower. Instead, she watched and waited, and prepared herself as best she could for whatever choice circumstances might eventually force upon her. She did not yet know that the council's meeting, scheduled for the following week, would set in motion a chain of events far beyond anything she could have anticipated, events that would test not only her own resolve, but the fragile, unacknowledged bond that still, despite everything, connected her to a king who remained unable to decide whether she was his greatest weakness or his only path toward becoming the ruler his kingdom truly needed. The council chamber sat at the heart of the Blackthorn Palace, a circular room lined with ancient stone pillars, each one carved with the symbols of the founding families who had built this kingdom generations ago. Damien had spent countless hours in this room since taking the throne, listening to arguments, weighing decisions, and enduring the constant, careful scrutiny of advisors who never quite let him forget how young he had been when the crown first settled on his head. Today, the tension in the chamber felt different, sharper, as 7 senior counselors took their seats around the polished stone table, their expressions ranging from carefully neutral to openly disapproving. At the head of the table, Damien remained standing, arms crossed, already anticipating the direction this meeting would take. "We have allowed this situation to continue far longer than wisdom would suggest," said Lord Edmund, the eldest of the council members, and the one whose opinion carried the most weight among the others. His silver hair and lined face spoke of decades spent navigating the treacherous currents of pack politics, and his sharp eyes missed very little. "The woman remains confined in the East Tower, a prisoner of war, bonded to our king by fate's cruel design, and yet no decision has been made regarding her future. This uncertainty breeds unrest, both among our people and, I suspect, among the remaining forces of her former pack, who surely wonder what has become of her. The situation is more complicated than a simple decision to be made and forgotten," Damien said, keeping his voice level despite the frustration building beneath his composed exterior. "She carries the bond mark. Any harm that comes to her risks consequences none of us can fully predict." "With respect, my king," said a younger counselor named Victor, his tone carrying just enough deference to avoid outright insolence. "The bond is precisely the problem we must address. A king bonded to enemy blood is a king whose loyalty will forever be questioned, whose judgment will forever be suspect. The longer this arrangement continues unresolved, the greater the damage to your authority." "What would you have me do?" Damien asked, his patience wearing thin. "Kill my own mate to satisfy concerns about appearances? Even if I were willing to consider such a thing, which I am not, the bond does not simply disappear because one half of it ceases to exist. Her death would leave scars on this pack far deeper than her continued presence ever could." A heavy silence fell over the chamber, and Damien watched several counselors exchange glances he could not quite interpret. It was Lord Edmund who finally broke the silence, his voice measured and careful. "No one is suggesting such drastic measures, my king," he said. "But there are other paths available to us. She could be returned to what remains of her pack, severing this connection through distance if not through death. Or, if you find yourself unable to release her entirely, she could be formally claimed as your mate, bringing whatever benefits and risks that decision entails, rather than remaining in this uncertain limbo that serves no one." Damien felt the weight of every eye in the room settle on him, waiting for his response. Claiming Elena openly meant accepting the vulnerability he had spent his entire reign avoiding, exposing himself to exactly the kind of weakness his father's death had taught him to fear above all else. Releasing her meant severing a bond that, despite everything, he could not deny had begun to matter to him in ways he was not yet ready to fully examine. "I need time," he said finally, though even to his own ears the words sounded weak, an evasion rather than a true answer. "Time," Lord Edmund repeated, something sharp entering his tone despite his careful respect. "My king, with all due respect, time is precisely what this council believes we can no longer afford to grant. Rumors already spread among the pack regarding the prisoner in the East Tower. Some speak of sympathy for her situation. Others speak of suspicion, wondering why a king who claims to fear enemy blood has not simply eliminated the threat entirely. Neither rumor serves the stability of your reign." The meeting continued for another hour, circling the same arguments from different angles, but Damien remained resistant to any concrete decision, deflecting each proposal with vague promises of consideration that satisfied no one, least of all himself. By the time the council finally dispersed, frustration hung thick in the air, and Damien could feel the weight of their growing impatience pressing down on him like a physical burden. He did not go directly to see Elena after the meeting ended, though some part of him wanted to, some instinct pulling him toward the tower even as his pride and exhaustion urged him elsewhere. Instead, he retreated to his private study, a small room lined with books and maps that had once belonged to his father, and sat alone in the fading afternoon light, turning the council's arguments over in his mind. It was there that Caleb found him, some hours later, letting himself into the study without waiting for formal permission, a privilege earned through years of friendship that predated Damien's crown by more than a decade. "You look troubled," Caleb observed, settling into the chair across from Damien's desk without being invited. "The council grows impatient," Damien said, not bothering to deny the obvious. "They want a decision. Release her, or claim her, but end the uncertainty that they believe threatens my authority." "And what do you want?" Caleb asked, his voice carrying none of the careful diplomacy the council members always employed, only blunt honesty born of genuine friendship. Damien did not answer immediately, staring instead at the maps spread across his desk, territories and boundaries that had cost his father's life to maintain, that Damien had spent every year since inheriting the crown fighting to protect. "I do not know," he admitted finally, the words feeling strange and unfamiliar in his mouth. He was not a man accustomed to uncertainty, not a king who allowed himself the luxury of not knowing his own mind. "That is not entirely true," Caleb said quietly. "I have known you since we were pups, Damien. I watched you deny your own grief when your father died, because you believed a king had no room for weakness. I watched you build walls around yourself so thick that even those who love you struggle to find a way through them. I do not think you truly do not know what you want. I think you are simply afraid to admit it, even to yourself." Damien's jaw tightened, old defenses rising automatically against words that struck closer to truth than he was comfortable acknowledging. "You presume much," he said, though the words lacked their usual sharpness. "Perhaps," Caleb allowed, "but I have also spoken with her, more than once, during my rounds near the tower. She is not what your council fears her to be, Damien. She is strong and proud, and has shown remarkable patience given everything she has endured since her capture. She has not once asked for special treatment, nor pleaded for mercy she does not believe she deserves. She has simply asked to be treated as more than a prisoner, more than a threat to be contained." "You speak as though you believe I should simply claim her. Consequences to my authority be damned," Damien said. "I speak as though I believe you already know, deep down, that continuing to deny the bond serves no one, least of all yourself," Caleb replied. "You have spent so many years proving your strength through control, through refusing to show anyone the parts of yourself that feel, that hope, that fear. But strength is not only found in walls, Damien. Sometimes it is found in the courage to tear them down." Damien said nothing for a long moment, the silence stretching between them heavy with everything Caleb's words had stirred up, old wounds and new uncertainties tangling together, until Damien could no longer clearly separate one from the other. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than before, stripped of its usual command. "Even if you are right," he said, "even if some part of me wishes to claim her openly, rather than continuing this uncertain arrangement, doing so would expose her to exactly the kind of danger I have been trying to protect her from. The council does not simply disapprove of my hesitation. Some among them would see her removed entirely, if given the opportunity and sufficient justification. Claiming her changes nothing about that danger. It may, in fact, make her a more visible target." Caleb's expression grew serious, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You are not merely protecting your own authority by keeping her hidden away," he said slowly. "You are trying to protect her from your own council." "They would not act openly against my expressed wishes," Damien said, though even he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. "But there are other ways to remove an inconvenience, ways that do not require open defiance of the throne. Accidents happen. Illnesses strike unexpectedly. I have seen such things before, in the earlier years of my reign, when counselors believed certain advisors had grown too influential, too dangerous to the balance of power they wished to maintain." The implication hung heavy between them, and Caleb's expression darkened with understanding. "Then you must act, Damien, one way or another, before that danger has the chance to manifest," Whatever path you choose, indecision itself has become the greatest risk to her safety. Damien knew Caleb was right, even as every instinct honed over years of careful, guarded rule urged him toward continued caution. He thought of Elena in her tower room, proud and unbroken despite everything she had endured, and felt something shift within him, some old wall beginning, almost imperceptibly, to crack. He did not yet know about the child, or rather children, growing within her, a secret that would soon make his careful deliberations feel almost quaint, in comparison to the urgency that truth would demand. He did not yet know how quickly circumstances were about to accelerate beyond anything his cautious nature could control. But sitting alone in his study long after Caleb had gone, staring at the maps of a kingdom he had sworn to protect at any cost, Damien began, for the first time since Elena's capture, to seriously consider what it might mean to choose her, openly and completely, regardless of the risks such a choice might carry. That same evening, unaware of the conversation taking place in Damien's study, Elena sat by her tower window, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon, feeling a strange restlessness she could not quite explain, as though her body somehow sensed that the careful, uneasy balance of her captivity was about to shift in ways she could not yet fully anticipate. She pressed a hand against her middle, feeling the slight, unmistakable evidence of the new life growing within her, and made a silent promise to the children she had not yet met. Whatever came next, whatever the council decided, whatever choice Damien ultimately made, she would protect them with everything she had. She had survived too much already to allow fear to determine her future now. After the council meeting had formally ended, 2 of its members lingered in the corridor outside the chamber, their voices low as the rest of the assembly dispersed toward their evening duties. Lord Edmund stood near a narrow window overlooking the palace grounds, his sharp eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the East Tower, while Victor waited beside him, patience wearing thin beneath his composed exterior. "He will not act," Victor said quietly, once he was certain no other ears remained within hearing distance. "You saw him today. He hides behind vague promises of consideration, while the danger to this kingdom grows with every week that passes." "Our king has always been slow to move against his own instincts," Lord Edmund replied, his tone carrying the weary patience of a man who had watched several rulers rise and fall over the course of his long service to the throne. "But do not mistake his hesitation for weakness. Damien has never once failed to act when the survival of this pack was genuinely threatened." "And is this not precisely such a threat?" Victor pressed. "A woman of enemy blood, bonded to our king against all reason, kept alive within our own walls, while her former pack surely watches and waits for some sign of weakness they might exploit." "I do not understand your patience in this matter, Edmund. You above all people understand what unresolved bonds have cost this kingdom before." Something flickered across Lord Edmund's weathered face, a shadow of old grief that he rarely allowed others to witness. "I understand better than you know," he said quietly. "I was there when Damien's mother died, carrying a grief this pack never fully permitted her to express, surrounded by counselors, myself included, who believed her gentleness made her unfit to guide difficult decisions. I have spent many years since wondering whether our judgment then was as sound as we believed it to be at the time." Victor's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features at this unexpected admission from a man not known for revisiting old regrets. "You cannot possibly believe the situations are comparable," he said. "Damien's mother was pack-born, beloved by our people from the moment of her birth. This woman is a stranger, raised among our enemies, bonded to our king, through nothing more than fate's careless design." "Perhaps," Lord Edmund allowed, though his tone remained thoughtful, rather than fully convinced. "Or perhaps we are once again allowing our fear of the unfamiliar to cloud judgment that circumstances have not yet fully tested. I do not say this to argue in her favor, Victor. I say it only to remind you, and myself, that certainty is a luxury this council has rarely been able to afford, however much we might wish otherwise." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a guard hurrying down the corridor, his expression carrying the particular urgency of someone bearing news he was not entirely certain how to deliver. He bowed briefly before Lord Edmund, the senior-most counselor present, before speaking. "My lord, forgive the interruption. I bring word from the East Tower. One of the guards on duty this afternoon observed something during the prisoner's exercise hour that he believed the council should know without delay." "Speak plainly," Lord Edmund said. The guard hesitated only a moment before continuing. The prisoner has begun showing signs consistent with pregnancy, my lord. The changes are subtle still, but unmistakable to those trained to notice such things. Given the timing since her capture, and given what is known of the bond between her and our king, there seems little reason to doubt the child, or children, are his. A heavy silence fell over the corridor, and Victor's expression shifted rapidly through surprise, then calculation, then something colder still, that made even Lord Edmund uneasy. This changes everything, Victor said finally, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. An heir born of enemy blood, carrying claim to this throne through both bond and birthright. The council must be informed immediately, before the king has any opportunity to shape how this information is received. We will inform the full council in due course, Lord Edmund said, though something in his own voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. But I would caution against hasty action, Victor. A pregnancy changes the stakes considerably, in ways that demand careful thought rather than swift, unconsidered response. Careful thought has already cost us weeks of dangerous uncertainty, Victor said, already turning to stride back toward the council chamber. I do not intend to allow it to cost us anything further. Lord Edmund remained by the window a moment longer after Victor had gone, watching the distant tower, where Elena's silhouette occasionally passed, before the narrow window of her prison. He thought of his own daughter, born decades ago and now grown with pups of her own, and felt an unfamiliar weight settle over his usually certain heart. Whatever came next, he suspected, would test this council, and this kingdom, in ways none of them had yet fully anticipated. News of Elena's pregnancy reached Damien before the sun had fully set that evening, delivered not by Victor's dramatic announcement to the full council, which would come later, but by Caleb himself, who had heard the guard's report through the palace's ever-active network of whispers, and had rushed to find Damien before anyone else could shape the telling of it. Say that again, Damien said, his voice dangerously quiet, when Caleb finished delivering the news in his private study. Elena is carrying your child, Caleb repeated, watching his friend carefully for any sign of how he might respond. The guards noticed changes during her exercise hour today. Given the timing, there is no reasonable doubt regarding the father. Damien stood motionless for a long moment, staring at nothing, his mind struggling to process information that upended every careful calculation he had been making since Elena's capture. A child. 2 lives. If his instincts as an alpha were reading the situation correctly, growing within the woman he had locked away in a tower, rather than claim as his own. The weight of it settled over him like a physical blow. How long has she known? He asked finally. I do not know, Caleb admitted. But given how carefully she has hidden the signs, I suspect she has known for some time. Long enough, certainly, to have made a deliberate choice not to tell you. Something hot and complicated twisted in Damien's chest, anger tangling with something that felt uncomfortably close to hurt. He had visited her, more than once, since her capture. He had stood in her tower room, close enough to feel the pull of the bond humming between them, and she had said nothing, had let him leave each time, without ever revealing the truth she carried. She kept this from me, he said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. Can you truly blame her? Caleb asked, not unkindly. You have shown her little reason to trust you with anything, Damien, let alone something as vulnerable as this. Put yourself in her position. A prisoner, alone, carrying children into a world that has offered her nothing but suspicion and cold stone walls. What reason would she have to believe you might respond with anything other than the same calculated coldness you have shown her since the day of her capture? The truth in Caleb's words stung more than Damien wanted to admit. He had given Elena every reason to guard herself against him, had built the very walls between them that now left him standing in his study, learning of his own children's existence second-hand, rather than from the woman carrying them. I must go to her, he said, already moving toward the door. Damien, Caleb called after him, something urgent in his voice that made Damien pause. Whatever you say to her, whatever you decide, remember that Victor already knows. He was there when the guard delivered his report, and I do not believe he will wait long before bringing this information before the full council. Whatever protection you intend to offer her and your children, you will need to move quickly. Damien nodded once, sharply, and left the study without another word, his long strides carrying him swiftly through the palace corridors toward the east tower. his mind racing through the implications of what he had just learned. By the time he reached the base of the tower stairs, guards straightening automatically at his approach, he had settled into a grim, focused determination that pushed aside every uncertainty that had plagued him for weeks. He took the stairs 2 at a time, and when he reached the heavy oak door, he did not wait for a guard to unlock it. He simply demanded the key, his tone leaving no room for hesitation, and stepped into the room the moment the lock gave way. Elena stood by the window, as she so often did, and turned at the sound of the door opening, her expression shifting rapidly from surprise to wariness the moment she saw the intensity in his eyes. "You know," she said quietly, understanding settling over her features before he had spoken a single word. "You are carrying my children," Damien said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "And you said nothing." Elena's chin lifted, that same proud, unbroken defiance she had shown him since the moment they met, rising to meet his anger head-on. "What was I meant to say?" she asked. "That I carry the children of a king who has locked me away like a threat to be contained? That I feared, with good reason, what your council might do with such knowledge, or what you yourself might decide once you learned the truth? You should have trusted me enough to tell me," Damien said, though even as he spoke the words, he heard how hollow they sounded, given everything he had done to earn precisely the opposite of her trust. "Trusted you?" Elena's voice rose, sharp with weeks of accumulated frustration and fear, finally finding release. "You have given me no reason to trust you with anything, Damien. You locked me in this tower the very day we met. You have visited me a handful of times in all these weeks, each visit brief and cold, more concerned with your council's opinion than with anything resembling care for the woman fate bonded you to. Why would I hand you information that powerful, not knowing whether you would see our children as precious or merely as another complication to be managed?" Her words landed like blows, each one striking closer to truth than Damien wanted to acknowledge. He had built this distance between them himself, brick by careful brick, and now stood facing the consequences of walls he had constructed with his own hands. "I am not without feeling, Elena," he said, his voice quieter now, some of the anger draining out of it, as something closer to genuine hurt took its place. "Whatever you believe of me, whatever cruelty you have witnessed since your capture, I did not intend for things to unfold this way. I have spent every day since you arrived trying to find some path forward that did not end in disaster for either of us." "And instead you found a tower," Elena said, though some of the fire in her own voice had begun to soften as well, the raw honesty of the moment wearing away at both their defenses. "Damien, I am carrying 2 lives within me. 2 children who will be born into this world regardless of whatever careful calculations you and your council continue to make. What kind of future do you imagine for them? Do you intend to keep them locked away as well, hidden from a kingdom that might see them as either weapons or threats depending on which way the political winds happen to blow?" Damien crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that Elena had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, the pull of the bond thrumming powerfully between them, despite the tension still simmering beneath their words. "No," he said, and the certainty in his voice surprised even himself. "I do not intend that. Whatever fear has driven my choices until now, I will not allow it to determine the fate of my own children." "Then what do you intend?" Elena asked, searching his face for some sign of the truth behind his words. "I intend to protect you," Damien said. "All 3 of you. Victor already knows of the pregnancy, and I have no doubt he intends to bring this before the full council, with all possible haste, hoping to force some decision before I have time to consider my response carefully. I will not allow that. Whatever else remains uncertain between us, Elena, I will not allow harm to come to you, or to our children." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching for deception in his expression, and finding, to her own surprise, something that looked remarkably like sincerity. It was not enough, not yet, to undo weeks of imprisonment and cold distance, but it was something, a small crack in the wall that had stood between them since the moment they met. "Words are easily spoken," she said finally, though without the sharp edge that had colored her voice only moments before. "Your council has already shown itself willing to consider dangerous solutions to what they perceive as threats to your throne. If you truly intend to protect us, you will need to do more than simply speak of good intentions within the privacy of this tower room." "I know," Damien said quietly, and I intend to prove it, starting tonight." He did not yet know exactly what form that protection would take, or how quickly he would need to act to outpace Victor's determination to force the council's hand. But standing there in the tower room, closer to Elena than he had allowed himself to be in weeks, feeling the powerful pull of the bond that connected them, and, beneath it, the undeniable reality of the children they had created together, Damien understood with sudden clarity that the careful, guarded existence he had built for himself since his father's death was no longer sustainable. Something had to change, and it had to change quickly, before his council's fear and ambition cost him everything that had suddenly, unexpectedly, become precious beyond measure. Before he left the tower that evening, Damien paused at the door, turning back to look at Elena one final time. "I will post additional guards around this tower tonight," he said. "Wolves loyal to me personally, not simply to the crown. I do not trust that Victor's ambitions will wait patiently for morning." "Guards did not stop your council from learning the truth in the first place," Elena pointed out, though her tone had lost most of its earlier hostility. "No," Damien admitted, "but better guards, chosen more carefully, might have. That is a mistake I do not intend to repeat." He hesitated, something unfamiliar working across his features, before adding, more quietly, "I am sorry, Elena. Not simply for tonight, but for every day since your capture that I allowed my own fear to determine how I treated you. Whatever comes next, you deserved better than the tower I gave you." The apology, unexpected and unpolished, seemed to affect Elena more than any of his earlier attempts at explanation. She said nothing for a long moment, studying him with an expression that had softened considerably from the guarded wariness she usually wore in his presence. "Thank you," she said finally, "for saying that. It does not erase what has happened, but it matters, more than you perhaps realize." Damien nodded once, then left, and Elena heard his footsteps descending the stairs more quickly than usual, the sound of urgency in every step. She remained by the window long after he had gone, watching the courtyard below where, true to his word, additional guards soon appeared, taking up positions around the tower's base, with an alertness that had been absent before. She did not sleep well that night, her mind turning over everything that had happened, the fear of Victor's ambitions, the fragile new understanding that had begun to form between herself and Damien, and beneath it all, a growing awareness of the children she carried, whose futures now depended on choices being made in council chambers and guarded tower rooms, far beyond their own understanding. Meanwhile, within the palace, Victor moved quickly to gather support among the council members most sympathetic to his concerns, calling an emergency session before the night was through. Word spread rapidly through the corridors that something significant had shifted, that the uncertain peace surrounding the prisoner in the East Tower had finally cracked open into something far more urgent. By morning, the entire palace seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which direction the coming storm would break. Damien, for his part, spent the remaining hours of darkness not sleeping but strategizing, drawing on every ounce of political skill he had developed over years of holding together a fragile throne, preparing himself for the confrontation he knew was coming with the first light of dawn. The council chamber was fuller than usual that morning, every senior member present and several junior advisors crowded near the walls, drawn by rumors that had spread through the palace overnight like wildfire through dry grass. Damien entered last, deliberately, taking his place at the head of the table, with the same commanding presence he had cultivated since the earliest days of his reign, though he could feel the unusual tension in the room pressing against him from every direction. Victor wasted no time. "My king," he began, rising from his seat before the formal proceedings had even properly opened. "Word has reached this council that the prisoner in the East Tower carries your children. Given the gravity of this development, I move that we address it immediately, before further delay allows the situation to grow beyond our ability to manage it wisely." "You will find," Damien said, his voice cutting through the murmur that had begun to ripple around the table, "that I have already given this matter considerable thought. I did not come here this morning to debate whether my children deserve protection. I came to inform this council of the decisions I have already made." A ripple of surprise passed through the assembled advisors, and Lord Edmund leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "Speak plainly, my king," he said. "This council deserves to understand the reasoning behind whatever course you have chosen." Damien's gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of each counselor in turn, searching for allies and adversaries alike among the familiar faces that had guided, and at times constrained, every major decision of his reign. "Elena carries my children," he said. "That is not a complication to be managed, nor a threat to be neutralized. It is a fact this council will learn to accept, one way or another." "With respect," Victor said, his composure fraying slightly at the directness of Damien's declaration. "Acceptance is precisely the danger this council has warned against from the beginning. An heir, or heirs, born of enemy blood, carrying legitimate claim to this throne through both bond and birth. Have you considered what such children might mean for the stability of this kingdom, particularly should her former pack attempt to use their existence as leverage in future conflicts?" "I have considered little else since learning of their existence," Damien said, "and I have concluded that hiding them away, treating them as a source of shame or vulnerability, would create precisely the weakness you fear, far more effectively than acknowledging them openly ever could." The chamber fell into a tense silence, and Damien could see the careful calculations playing out behind the eyes of every counselor present, weighing the political risks of open opposition against a king who had, for the first time in recent memory, spoken with such unyielding certainty on a matter of personal significance. It was Lord Edmund who spoke next, his voice thoughtful rather than confrontational. "My king, I do not doubt the sincerity of your resolve, but resolve alone does not neutralize genuine danger. Whatever your intentions toward the woman and her children, there remain those within this pack, and beyond it, who would see their existence as an opportunity rather than a cause for celebration. How do you intend to protect them from threats that no amount of royal declaration can fully eliminate?" It was a fair question, and Damien had spent the long hours of the previous night wrestling with precisely this concern. "I have decided," he said, choosing his words carefully, "that Elena and our children will be moved to a location beyond the immediate reach of palace politics, at least until they are born, and the immediate danger of this transition period has passed. A remote residence, at the edge of our territory, guarded by wolves whose loyalty I trust absolutely, away from the concentrated ambitions and rivalries that make the palace itself such a dangerous place for someone in her position." Elena, had she been present in the chamber, would have recognized the echo of exile in his careful phrasing, though Damien himself viewed it differently, as a necessary shield rather than a continuation of her imprisonment. The council, for their part, seemed to find the proposal at least tolerable, murmurs of cautious approval replacing the earlier tension that had gripped the room. "This arrangement satisfies the council's concerns regarding immediate political stability," Lord Edmund said slowly, "provided the location remains sufficiently secure and sufficiently distant from any influence that might complicate matters further. I would ask, however, my king, whether you have consulted the woman herself regarding this decision, given that it will significantly alter her circumstances once again." The question struck closer to an uncomfortable truth than Damien wished to acknowledge. He had not yet spoken to Elena about this specific plan, had decided upon it during the long hours of the previous night without her input, driven by the same instinct toward unilateral decision-making that had shaped every choice of his reign until now. "I will speak with her directly," he said, "before any final arrangements are made." The council session continued for another hour, working through logistical details, the selection of guards, the specific location to be used, the timeline for the transition, but Damien found his attention repeatedly drifting toward the conversation he knew awaited him once this meeting concluded, a conversation he suspected would not go as smoothly as he might hope. He was right to anticipate difficulty. When he finally made his way to the East Tower that afternoon, informing Elena of the council's decision and his own role in shaping it, her reaction was immediate and sharp. "You are exiling me," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, "and you call it protection." "It is protection," Damien insisted, though even as he spoke the words, he could hear how similar they sounded to justifications he had offered before, in different forms, since the very first day of her captivity. "The palace is not safe for you, Elena. Not with Victor and others like him actively seeking ways to use our children against us. A remote location, away from the concentrated ambitions of the court, offers genuine safety that this tower, for all its guards, cannot fully provide." "A remote location," Elena repeated, her tone bitter. "Further from you, further from any influence I might have over decisions that affect my own life, my own children. Forgive me if I struggle to see the meaningful difference between this arrangement and the tower I have already endured for weeks." "The difference," Damien said, frustration creeping into his own voice despite his effort to remain patient, "is that this decision is made in service of your safety, not merely my own political convenience. I understand your anger, Elena. Truly I do. But I cannot protect you and our children while you remain within easy reach of a council, still actively searching for ways to eliminate what they perceive as a threat to this throne." Elena studied him for a long moment, some of her anger giving way, reluctantly, to a more measured consideration of his words. She did not fully trust his motivations, not yet, not after everything that had passed between them since her capture, but she recognized, too, the genuine concern beneath his careful political calculations, the fear of losing something he had only just begun to allow himself to value. "And what happens," she asked finally, "once our children are born? Do you intend to keep us hidden away indefinitely, out of sight, out of consideration, simply because it proves more convenient for maintaining your council's fragile peace?" "No," Damien said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty he still carried regarding exactly how he would navigate the challenges still ahead. "This is a temporary measure, Elena, not a permanent solution. Once our children are born, once the immediate danger of this transition has passed, I intend to bring you back to the palace, openly, as my mate and queen, regardless of whatever resistance my council continues to offer." Elena wanted to believe him. Some part of her, despite everything, still felt the pull of the bond that connected them, still recognized the genuine effort he had begun to make since learning the truth of her pregnancy. But weeks of imprisonment had taught her caution, and she was not prepared to surrender that caution easily, even in the face of promises that sounded, for the first time, genuinely sincere. "I will go," she said finally, "not because I trust your council's intentions, and not entirely because I trust yours either, but because I understand the danger you describe as real, and because I will do whatever is necessary to protect our children, regardless of the personal cost to myself." Something in Damien's expression shifted at her words, a complicated mixture of relief and something that looked almost like shame at the trust she was extending, despite everything he had failed to earn. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know this arrangement asks a great deal of you, Elena, after everything you have already endured. I will do everything within my power to ensure it does not stretch on longer than absolutely necessary." Elena said nothing further, turning back toward the window, as she so often did when the weight of her circumstances grew too heavy to bear in conversation. Behind her, Damien lingered a moment longer than usual before finally taking his leave, and neither of them spoke of the quiet, unspoken hope beginning to form between them, fragile as new growth after a long winter, that whatever lay ahead might yet prove better than everything that had come before. The preparations for her departure took place over the following 3 days, conducted with a speed and secrecy that spoke to the genuine urgency Damien felt regarding her safety. Clara helped her gather what few belongings she had accumulated during her weeks in the tower, working with quiet efficiency while stealing occasional glances at Elena that carried something like worry beneath their usual careful neutrality. "You will be safer away from the palace," Clara said, folding a simple woolen cloak into a traveling bag. "Whatever else is true of this arrangement, I believe that much sincerely." "I hope you are right," Elena said, watching the young woman work. "I confess, I have grown weary of being moved from one cage to another, however each new cage might be dressed up in the language of protection." Clara paused in her folding, meeting Elena's eyes directly for perhaps the first time since they had met. "For what it is worth, my lady, I do not believe this new arrangement is truly a cage, not in the way the tower was. The king has chosen the location himself, and has selected only guards whose loyalty to him personally, rather than to the council, is beyond question. I have heard the servants speak of it. This is different from before." Elena wanted to believe her, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did, at least partially. Whatever her lingering doubts about Damien's full intentions, she could not deny that something had shifted in him since he learned of her pregnancy, some crack in the careful armor he had worn since the day of her capture. On the morning of her departure, Caleb himself arrived to escort her from the tower, a detail that Elena understood, without needing to be told, represented another deliberate choice on Damien's part, placing someone he trusted absolutely in direct charge of her safety during the journey ahead. The Alpha King asked me personally to see you safely to your new residence, Caleb said, as they descended the tower stairs together, for what Elena hoped would be the final time. He wished to accompany you himself, but circumstances within the council required his continued presence at the palace, at least for these first crucial days. Circumstances, or Victor's continued scheming? Elena asked, unable to fully mask the wariness that still colored her view of palace politics. Caleb's expression grew serious. Both, if I am honest, he said. Victor has not abandoned his concerns simply because the council reached a temporary agreement. Damien remains behind, partly to ensure that agreement holds, and partly to prevent Victor from using his absence to stir further unrest among councillors still uncertain about the wisdom of this arrangement. The journey to the remote residence took the better part of a day, traveling first by covered carriage along the main roads leading away from the palace, then by foot, along narrower forest paths, as the terrain grew too rough for wheeled transport. Elena found herself grateful for the physical activity, after so many weeks confined to a single tower room, though the guards accompanying them insisted on frequent rest stops, mindful of her condition, even as she insisted she felt stronger than her circumstances might suggest. The cabin itself, when they finally arrived as afternoon light began to soften toward evening, surprised Elena with its modest comfort. Built from sturdy timber and set within a small clearing surrounded by dense forest on all sides, it offered privacy without the harsh isolation she had feared. A single main room with a stone hearth, a smaller adjoining chamber that would serve as her sleeping quarters, and windows that let in generous natural light without the iron bars that had marked her tower prison. It is not the palace, Caleb said, watching her survey the space, but I hope it might feel less like a cage than what you have grown accustomed to. It already does, Elena admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of the observation. There was something almost peaceful about the quiet of the surrounding forest, the absence of the constant political tension that had permeated every corner of the palace since her capture. For the first time in longer than she could easily remember, she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps, despite everything, some version of peace might yet be possible. Weeks passed at the forest cabin, and Elena found herself settling into a rhythm unlike anything she had experienced since the fall of her pack. Mornings began with the sound of birdsong, rather than the distant clang of palace guards changing shifts, and her days filled with small, meaningful tasks, tending a modest garden the previous occupants had left behind, walking the perimeter paths within the boundaries the guards permitted, and slowly, cautiously, allowing herself to imagine a future for the children growing within her that did not depend entirely on the goodwill of a distant, uncertain throne. Damien visited more often than she had expected, arriving every few days, despite the demands of ruling a kingdom still simmering with political tension. Each visit brought its own small revelations, moments where the careful, guarded king began to show glimpses of the man beneath the crown, someone capable of warmth and humor that Elena had not imagined existed beneath his cold exterior during those first difficult weeks of her captivity. "You seem well," he observed one afternoon, finding her seated on a wooden bench outside the cabin, her hands resting on the noticeable curve of her belly as she watched sunlight filter through the surrounding trees. "I am well," Elena said, and meant it, a simple truth that would have seemed impossible only a month before. "The quiet here suits me. I did not realize how much the constant tension of the palace had worn on me until I finally escaped it." Damien settled onto the bench beside her, close enough that she could feel the familiar pull of the bond, though it no longer carried the same uncomfortable weight it once had. Over these weeks of visits, something between them had shifted, slowly and carefully, into something that felt less like adversaries bound by unwelcome fate, and more like two people cautiously discovering what genuine partnership might feel like. "I am glad," he said, and something in his voice carried a sincerity that would have seemed impossible from the cold, distant king who had first locked her in the East Tower. "Divorce peace, Elena. After everything you have endured, because of decisions I made, or failed to make, in the early days of our bond." Elena studied him for a moment, noting the genuine remorse still visible in his expression whenever their earlier history arose in conversation. "You have changed," she observed, "since those first weeks. I do not know if I fully understand why, but I notice it, every time you visit." Damien considered the observation carefully before responding. his gaze drifting toward the forest surrounding them. "I think," he said slowly, "that I spent so many years building walls to protect myself from vulnerability, that I forgot what it felt like to simply be honest, with others, and with myself. Learning of our children forced me to confront how much of my own life I had sacrificed to fear, disguised as strength. I do not wish to pass that same fear on to them, or to continue inflicting it upon you." It was, Elena recognized, one of the most honest things he had ever said to her, stripped of the careful political calculation that had colored so much of their earlier conversations. She reached out, almost without thinking, and placed her hand over his where it rested on the bench between them. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for telling me that." Damien's gaze dropped to their joined hands, and something shifted in his expression, softening into an emotion Elena had never before seen him allow himself to show so openly. "Elena," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "I know I have given you every reason to doubt my sincerity. I know trust, once broken, cannot simply be rebuilt through words alone. But I want you to know that whatever fear drove my earlier choices, it does not reflect what I feel for you now, or for the children we are about to welcome into this world." Elena felt something warm bloom in her chest, cautious hope mingling with the lingering wariness that weeks of imprisonment had taught her to maintain. "I want to believe that," she said honestly. "I am trying to believe it, more each day. But Damien, actions will always speak louder than words, particularly given everything that has passed between us." "Then I will continue proving it through actions," Damien said, "for as long as it takes." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of one of the guards approaching from the tree line, his expression carrying the particular urgency that had come to signal news from the palace. Damien rose immediately, his relaxed posture shifting back into the alert bearing of a king constantly aware of the political currents he had left behind. "My king," the guard said, bowing briefly. "Word has arrived from the palace. Lord Edmund requests your presence regarding matters that cannot wait for your return." Damien's jaw tightened, old tension returning to his shoulders even as he glanced back toward Elena with clear reluctance. "I must go," he said, "but I will return as soon as circumstances allow." "I understand," Elena said, though she could not fully suppress the small flicker of disappointment that came with watching him prepare to leave. Weeks of careful, patient visits had built something fragile and precious between them, and every departure back toward palace politics carried with it the uncertain possibility that whatever ground they had gained might somehow be undone by forces neither of them could fully control. After Damien departed, escorted by his guard back toward the palace, Elena remained on the bench outside the cabin, watching the trees sway gently in the afternoon breeze, her hands resting protectively over her belly, where she could feel the occasional, reassuring movement of the children within. She thought of the healer who had begun visiting the cabin regularly in recent weeks, an older woman named Ivy, who had confirmed what Elena had long suspected, that she carried not one child but two, their heartbeats strong and steady whenever Ivy pressed her careful hands against Elena's growing belly. "Twins," Ivy had said, during her most recent visit, "are considered a rare blessing among wolf packs, my lady. Some among the older generations speak of ancient prophecies tied to twin births, particularly among royal bloodlines, though I confess I have never put much stock in such old stories myself." Elena had asked, curious despite herself, what such prophecies claimed, but Ivy had only shaken her head, offering a vague, uncertain answer about power and destiny that Elena had not thought much about since. Now, sitting alone in the quiet peace of the forest clearing, she found herself wondering, not for the first time, what kind of future truly awaited the children she carried, born of a bond neither she nor Damien had chosen, into a kingdom still uncertain whether to welcome or fear them. She did not yet know how soon those questions would demand answers, or how quickly the fragile peace she had found within this forest clearing would be tested by forces gathering, unseen, both within the palace and beyond it. For now, she simply allowed herself to enjoy the quiet of the afternoon, the warmth of the sun on her skin, and the small, precious hope that had begun, cautiously, to take root within her heart, alongside the children, growing steadily toward the moment of their birth. Back at the palace, Damien found Lord Edmund waiting in the council chamber, though this time alone, without the full assembly that had gathered for their previous confrontations. The older counselor's expression carried none of its usual careful neutrality, replaced instead by something that looked almost like urgency. "You did not need to summon the full council for this conversation," Damien observed, taking his seat across from the older man. "No," Lord Edmund agreed, "because what I have to say is not yet ready for the council's ears, and may never need to be, depending on how you choose to respond. Victor has been meeting privately with several of the junior advisors, my king, building support for a proposal he intends to bring before the full assembly regarding the children once they are born." Damien felt his jaw tighten. "What proposal?" "He believes," Lord Edmund said carefully, "that the safest path forward involves separating you from the woman and her children entirely once they are born, allowing you to name an heir through a more politically advantageous union, while the twins are raised quietly, away from public knowledge of their true parentage, removing any claim they might otherwise carry to your throne." The suggestion hit Damien like a physical blow, fury rising so quickly that he had to grip the edge of the table to keep his composure. "He intends to erase my own children from their birthright," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "He intends to protect what he believes is the stability of this kingdom," Lord Edmund corrected, though his tone carried little sympathy for Victor's position. "I do not agree with his proposal, Damien, and I have told him as much directly. But I would be doing you a disservice if I did not warn you that his influence among the junior council members grows with each passing week, that this situation remains unresolved. You would be wise to move decisively, and soon, before he gathers enough support to make his proposal difficult to refuse outright." Damien absorbed this warning in tense silence, his mind already working through the implications, the dangers, the countermeasures he would need to consider. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally. "I will not allow Victor's ambitions to determine the fate of my own family." "See that you do not," Lord Edmund said, rising from his seat. "And Damien, if I may offer one further piece of counsel, born of decades spent watching this throne weather storms both external and internal. The council responds to strength, but not merely the strength of denial and control you have shown throughout most of your reign. They respond, too, to the strength of genuine conviction, openly claimed, rather than quietly defended. If you truly intend to claim Elena and your children as your own, the sooner you do so publicly, and without hesitation, the sooner Victor's schemes lose whatever power they currently hold." The words stayed with Damien long after Lord Edmund had departed, turning over in his mind as he made his way back toward his private study, already beginning to plan how he might move against Victor's growing influence, before it solidified into something more difficult to counter. Meanwhile, back at the forest cabin, Elena had returned inside as evening approached, settling near the hearth where Ivy had arrived for her regular evening visit, checking on the progress of the pregnancy with the same careful, practiced hands she always used. "The children grow strong," Ivy said, pressing gently against Elena's belly, a small smile crossing her weathered face at whatever she felt beneath her palms. "Stronger, if I am honest, than I typically observe at this stage of pregnancy, even among wolf-born children. Is that unusual?" Elena asked, a flicker of concern entering her voice. "Unusual, yes, though not necessarily cause for worry," Ivy said. "Twin births carry their own particular strength, and royal bloodlines, bonded through true mates rather than arranged unions, often produce children of remarkable vitality. I have heard old stories, passed down through generations of healers before me, of such children carrying gifts beyond the ordinary, though I confess, such tales have grown rare enough in recent generations that I cannot say how much truth remains within them." Elena thought of the ancient prophecy Ivy had mentioned weeks before, still vague and mysterious despite her curiosity. "Will you tell me more of these old stories?" she asked. "I find myself wondering, more each day, what kind of futures awaits children born under such unusual circumstances." Ivy hesitated, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps another time, my lady, when I have had opportunity to consult my own teacher's writings more carefully. Old stories carry old dangers when spoken carelessly, and I would not wish to burden you with speculation when the truth of your children's futures will reveal itself soon enough, through their own actions, rather than through my uncertain retelling of ancient tales." Elena accepted this gentle deflection with quiet patience, though the mystery lingered in her thoughts long after Ivy had departed for the evening. joining the many other uncertainties that continued to shape the strange, uneasy piece of her life within the forest clearing. The first sign came just after midnight, a deep, tightening pain that pulled Elena from sleep so suddenly that she gasped aloud into the darkness of her small chamber. She lay still for a moment, waiting to see if it would pass, but another wave followed close behind the first, stronger this time, unmistakable in what it meant. "Ivy," she called out, her voice carrying through the thin walls of the cabin toward the small adjoining room where the healer had taken to staying in these final weeks of the pregnancy, anticipating exactly this moment. "Ivy, I think it is time." Within moments, Ivy appeared at her bedside, already alert despite the late hour, her practiced hands moving quickly to assess Elena's condition. "The children are coming," she confirmed, a mixture of calm reassurance and focused urgency in her voice. "Do not be afraid, my lady. I have delivered many children in my years, though I confess, never twins carrying quite the strength I have felt in these two over these past months." The hours that followed blurred together in Elena's memory, a haze of pain and effort, punctuated by Ivy's steady, encouraging voice, guiding her through each stage of labor. Word had been sent to the palace the moment the first signs appeared, a young guard dispatched at a full run through the darkened forest paths, though Elena knew, even in the depths of her labor, that Damien could not possibly arrive in time, the distance between the cabin and the palace too great to cross before the birth itself would be complete. She found, to her own surprise, that she did not need him there in the way she might once have expected. Ivy's steady presence, along with the fierce, protective love already blooming in her heart for the children she was about to meet, carried her through hours of difficult labor with a strength she had not fully known she possessed. She thought, in the brief moments between the waves of pain, of everything she had survived to reach this point, the fall of her pack, the weeks of imprisonment, the uncertain journey toward whatever fragile trust now existed between herself and Damien, and she drew on all of it, every hard-won ounce of resilience, to carry her through these final, demanding hours. Dawn was beginning to color the sky outside the cabin windows when the first child finally arrived, a boy, his cry filling the small room with a strength that made even Ivy pause in surprise, before quickly wrapping him in a soft blanket and placing him against Elena's chest. "He is strong," Ivy said, wonder evident in her voice. Remarkably strong for a newborn. Elena had little time to fully absorb this before the second wave of labor began, and less than an hour later, the second child arrived as well, a girl, her cry rising to meet her brother's, in a strange, harmonious duet that raised the hair on Ivy's arms, even as she moved efficiently to complete her care of both mother and children. "Twins," Ivy murmured, settling the second child into Elena's waiting arms alongside her brother. "Just as I suspected these past months. A boy and a girl, both strong, both healthy, born as the sun rises. If the old stories carry any truth at all, this is an auspicious beginning indeed." Elena looked down at her children, exhaustion warring with an overwhelming rush of love so powerful it nearly stole her breath entirely. The boy had a shock of dark hair, already thick despite his newborn state, while his sister's was lighter, though both children shared eyes of a striking amber color that seemed to catch and hold the early morning light streaming through the cabin windows. "They are beautiful," Elena whispered, tears gathering in her eyes as she studied each small, perfect face in turn. "Whatever else happens now, whatever the palace decides, whatever fate has in store for us, I will protect them, with everything I have." Ivy moved quietly around the room, cleaning and organizing with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed such tasks countless times before, though her expression remained thoughtful, occasionally glancing back toward the newborns with an expression Elena could not quite interpret. "What troubles you?" Elena asked, noticing the healer's continued attention toward her children. Ivy hesitated before answering, choosing her words carefully. "There is an old prophecy, my lady, one I mentioned to you weeks ago, without fully explaining its details. I did not wish to burden you with speculation during your pregnancy, but now that your children have arrived, I feel it only right to share what little I know." Elena's attention sharpened despite her exhaustion. "Tell me." "The prophecy speaks of twins born from a bond, forged in conflict rather than choice," Ivy said slowly. "Children carrying the blood of two warring bloodlines, united not by peace treaties or political arrangement, but by the undeniable pull of true fate itself. It says such children, when the moment is right, will possess a power capable of ending generations of conflict between their parents' peoples, a power that reveals itself not through ordinary growth, but through a single, unmistakable sign beneath the full moon. What sign? Elena asked, her heart beating faster despite her physical exhaustion. The prophecy does not say precisely, Ivy admitted. Old texts are often frustratingly vague on such details, more concerned with poetic meaning than practical specifics. But it speaks of a howl, my lady, one that reaches every corner of the territory, marking the children as true heirs of destiny, rather than mere accidents of a forced bond. Elena absorbed this information in quiet wonder, looking down at her sleeping children with fresh eyes, searching for some visible sign of the extraordinary destiny the old prophecy seemed to suggest awaited them. They looked, in this quiet morning moment, simply like any newborn children, small and vulnerable and entirely dependent on her protection, and she found herself hoping, fiercely, that whatever power the prophecy spoke of would not come at the cost of the simple, ordinary childhood she wished, more than anything, to provide for them. By mid-morning, word had reached the palace of the successful birth, and Damien arrived at the cabin not long after, having ridden through the forest with a speed that left his horse lathered and exhausted by the time he reached the clearing. He burst through the cabin door with an urgency that immediately softened the moment his eyes fell upon Elena, propped up in bed with a child cradled in each arm, exhaustion and joy mingling clearly across her tired features. "Elena," he breathed, crossing the room quickly to kneel beside the bed, his gaze moving between her face and the two small forms she held, with a reverence Elena had never before seen him display. "Are you well? Are they well?" "We are all well," Elena assured him, watching carefully as he studied his children's faces for the first time, something raw and unguarded crossing his expression that she recognized, with a small jolt of surprise, as genuine, overwhelming emotion. A boy and a girl, strong and healthy, according to Ivy. Damien reached out with careful, uncertain hands, as though afraid he might somehow damage something so precious through simple contact, and gently touched his son's small hand, then his daughter's, wonder replacing the guarded caution that had defined so much of his demeanor since their first meeting. "They are perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. "Elena, I do not have words for what I feel, looking at them. I have spent so many years believing that vulnerability was a weakness a king could not afford, and yet looking at these two small lives, I feel more vulnerable than I ever have in my entire reign, and somehow, impossibly, it does not feel like weakness at all." Elena watched him carefully, searching his face for any sign of the calculating distance that had once defined their relationship, and finding, instead, only genuine, undefended emotion. "What will you name them?" she asked softly. Damien considered the question carefully, his gaze moving between his children's faces. "I would like your thoughts before I offer my own," he said. "They are as much yours as mine, Elena, perhaps more so, given everything you have endured to bring them safely into this world." Elena felt something warm settle in her chest at this small but meaningful gesture, a genuine partnership rather than the unilateral decisions that had once characterized so much of their interaction. Together, over the following hour, as their children slept peacefully between them, they settled on names that felt right for two lives already, in their own small way, beginning to reshape the future of an entire kingdom. Their son they named Nathaniel, and their daughter Rosalind, names that carried weight and dignity, without sacrificing the warmth Elena hoped would define their childhood. Ivy, watching from a respectful distance as the small family settled into these first precious hours together, allowed herself a quiet, hopeful smile. Whatever old prophecies might eventually reveal themselves through these two remarkable children, she thought, watching Damien carefully adjust his daughter's blanket, with hands that had clearly never before held something quite so fragile and precious. Perhaps the true beginning of their story lay not in ancient texts or mysterious destinies, but in this simple, ordinary moment of a father finally allowing himself to love without fear. The peace of that morning, however, would not last uninterrupted for long. Even as Elena and Damien settled into the quiet joy of their children's first hours, word of the successful birth was already spreading beyond the forest clearing, carried by messengers and whispered rumors toward a palace where not everyone would receive the news with equal warmth. Victor received the news that afternoon, delivered by a junior advisor who had rushed to find him the moment official word arrived at the palace gates. He listened in tight-lipped silence, his expression carefully neutral even as something cold and calculating settled behind his eyes. "Twins," he repeated, once the advisor had finished his report. "Both healthy, both strong." And the king rushed to the cabin, the moment word reached him, I assume. "Yes, my lord," the advisor confirmed. By all accounts, he left within moments of receiving the message, without waiting for escort or ceremony. Victor dismissed the advisor with a curt nod, then remained alone in his private chambers for a long while, turning the news over in his mind, searching for some angle that might yet serve his purposes. The birth complicated matters considerably. A living heir, or in this case two, born of a genuine mate bond, carried a legitimacy that would prove far more difficult to dismiss or maneuver around than an unresolved pregnancy had been. Whatever plans he had begun quietly cultivating among the junior council members would need careful reconsideration in light of this new reality. He sought out Lord Edmund later that evening, finding the older counselor in the palace library, reviewing old texts by candlelight, with the same patient thoroughness he brought to every task he undertook. "You have heard the news," Victor said, settling into a chair across from Edmund's reading table without waiting for invitation. "I have," Edmund said, not looking up from the text before him. "I confess I find myself relieved, Victor, more than I expected to feel. Whatever concerns I have carried about the political complications of this situation, I cannot deny the simple, undeniable truth of a bond that has produced healthy children. Nature does not often grant such clear answers to questions we humans insist on complicating." "You speak as though the danger has passed," Victor said, frustration edging into his voice. "It has not, Edmund. If anything, the birth of these children raises the stakes considerably. Rival packs will hear of this bond, of these twins carrying claim to our throne through both blood and bond. Do you truly believe every faction within our own borders, let alone beyond them, will simply accept this development without challenge?" Edmund finally looked up from his reading, studying Victor with an expression that carried more weariness than anger. "I believe," he said, "that this pack has weathered greater challenges than a king choosing at last to embrace rather than fear his own bonded family. I believe too, Victor, that your continued opposition risks placing you on the wrong side of a decision that grows more settled with each passing day. Damien has made his choice. The children are born, healthy and strong. Whatever concerns you continue to harbor, I would counsel considerable caution before pursuing them further." Victor's jaw tightened at the implicit warning in Edmund's words, but he said nothing further, rising instead to take his leave, his mind already turning toward other avenues, other allies, other ways to ensure that his concerns did not simply fade away with the growing sentiment of acceptance spreading through the palace. Back at the forest cabin, unaware of the political currents already shifting in response to their children's birth, Elena and Damien spent the remainder of that first day in quiet, precious companionship, taking turns holding Nathaniel and Rosalind as the newborns slept, occasionally waking to feed, or simply to look around with the unfocused, curious gaze of children barely hours old. "I should return to the palace soon," Damien said reluctantly, as evening began to settle over the forest clearing. "Even a single day's absence invites speculation among the council, and I do not wish to give Victor, or others like him, any further opportunity to sow doubt, while my attention remains focused elsewhere." "I understand," Elena said, though she could not fully suppress the small pang of disappointment that came with watching him prepare to leave so soon after such a momentous day. "As soon as circumstances allow," Damien promised, gently pressing a kiss to his daughter's forehead, then his son's, before turning to look at Elena with an expression that carried none of the guarded distance that had once defined nearly every interaction between them. "Elena, I know words alone cannot undo everything that has passed between us since your capture, but I want you to know that today, watching our children take their first breaths, watching you hold them with such fierce, protective love, I understood more clearly than ever before exactly what I nearly lost through my own fear and pride. I do not intend to make that same mistake again." Elena reached out and took his hand, the gesture simple but carrying weight that neither of them needed to voice aloud. "Come back to us soon," she said softly. Damien nodded, then rose reluctantly. gathering his cloak before pausing once more at the cabin door, looking back at the small, precious family he had so nearly failed to claim, before finally stepping out into the gathering darkness to begin his journey back toward the palace and the political storm he suspected awaited him there. Ivy, who had given the small family privacy throughout much of that first day, returned to check on Elena and the twins once Damien had departed, her expression thoughtful as she settled into a chair near the hearth. "He loves them," Ivy observed quietly. "And you, my lady, if I may say so without overstepping." Elena looked down at her sleeping children, exhaustion and joy still mingling in equal measure within her heart. "I believe he is trying," she said carefully. "Whether that proves enough, against everything his counsel and his own fears might yet throw against us, remains to be seen." "Perhaps," Ivy said, "but I have lived long enough to recognize the difference between a man performing duty and a man discovering genuine love for the first time in his life. Whatever comes next, my lady, I do not believe you face it with a king who sees your children merely as political inconveniences any longer." Elena found comfort in Ivy's words, though she remained cautious, unwilling to fully surrender the careful guard she had maintained since the earliest days of her captivity. She had learned, through hard experience, that hope required tempering with realism, that the path ahead, however brightened by today's precious developments, remained far from certain. But as she settled back against her pillows, her children sleeping peacefully in the cradle Ivy had prepared weeks before, she allowed herself, at least for this one evening, to simply feel grateful for the small, fragile family that had, against every earlier expectation, begun to take shape from the ashes of war and imprisonment. 3 weeks after the twins' birth, an elderly scholar named Marcus arrived unannounced at the palace gates, requesting urgent audience with the Alpha King regarding a matter he claimed could not wait for formal scheduling. Damien, initially inclined to dismiss the request given the countless demands already pressing on his attention, agreed to see the scholar only after Lord Edmund vouched for the man's reputation as one of the foremost keepers of ancient pack histories remaining within their territory. Marcus entered the private study with a worn leather satchel clutched carefully against his chest, his eyes bright with an urgency that belied his advanced years. "My king," he said, bowing briefly, before settling into the chair Damien offered. "Forgive my haste in seeking this audience, but word of your children's birth reached my study 3 days ago, and I have spent every waking hour since, confirming what I believe to be a matter of considerable importance to this kingdom's future." "Speak plainly," Damien said, his patience already thin after weeks of managing council tensions alongside his newfound joy in fatherhood. Marcus opened his satchel and withdrew a bundle of ancient, carefully preserved texts, their pages yellowed with age, but still legible beneath careful handling. "These texts," he said, "were written generations ago, during the earliest days of our pack's founding, by a seer whose predictions proved remarkably accurate throughout her lifetime. Among her writings is a prophecy that I believe speaks directly to your children, my king, a prophecy concerning twins, born of a bond, forged through conflict rather than choice." Damien felt a chill move through him, recalling the vague mention Elena had shared weeks ago regarding something Ivy had told her during the pregnancy. "Continue," he said. "The prophecy speaks of children who will unite 2 warring bloodlines," Marcus said, "ending a curse that has quietly plagued this pack for generations, a curse born of the very conflict that first divided your people from Elena's, generations before either of you were born. According to these texts, the curse has manifested subtly over the years, in shortened lifespans among alpha rulers, in the persistent instability that has plagued every generation's attempt at lasting peace, in the strange difficulty this bloodline has always faced in producing more than a single heir. You are suggesting my father's early death, and his father's before him, relate to this curse," Damien said slowly, old grief mixing with a growing sense of unease. "I am suggesting it is possible," Marcus said carefully. "The texts are not entirely clear on every detail, as is often the case with prophecies recorded generations before the events they describe, but the pattern matches closely enough that I felt compelled to bring this information before you directly, rather than allow you to remain unaware of what your children's birth might truly represent." "And how does the prophecy suggest this curse might be broken?" Damien asked, leaning forward despite himself, drawn into the scholar's account despite his earlier skepticism. "Through a sign," Marcus said, "one that will reveal itself beneath a full moon, when the children are still young, marking them clearly as the ones destined to end the old conflict. The texts describe it as a howl, unified and impossibly powerful for children so young, one that will be heard and felt by every wolf within the territory, regardless of distance." Damien absorbed this information in tense silence, his mind working through the implications, the danger, the opportunities such a prophecy might represent, both for his family and for the kingdom he had sworn to protect. "When is the next full moon?" he asked finally. 11 days from now, my king," Marcus said, "should the prophecy prove accurate, and I confess I cannot say with certainty that it will. That night may mark a turning point, unlike any this kingdom has witnessed in generations." After Marcus departed, having left his precious texts for Damien's further study, Damien remained alone in his study for a long while, turning the scholar's words over in his mind. He thought of Elena, of Nathaniel and Rosalind sleeping peacefully in their cradle at the forest cabin, unaware of the weight of destiny that ancient texts now suggested rested upon their small shoulders. He thought too of Victor, and of how such a prophecy, should it prove true and become known throughout the pack, might either strengthen his family's position beyond any council's ability to challenge it, or, in the wrong hands, become yet another weapon wielded against them. He decided, after careful consideration, to share the news with Elena directly, rather than allow rumors to reach her secondhand, riding out to the cabin that same evening, despite the lateness of the hour. Elena listened to his account of Marcus's visit with growing wonder, occasionally glancing toward the cradle where her children slept, searching their small, peaceful faces for some hint of the extraordinary destiny the old prophecy seemed to suggest awaited them. "Ivy mentioned something similar, weeks ago," she said, once Damien had finished. She seemed reluctant to share more, as though the old stories carried a weight she did not wish to burden me with, during my pregnancy. "What do you make of it?" Damien asked. "Do you believe such prophecies carry genuine truth, or are they simply old stories, given new significance by our own hopeful imaginations?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not know," she admitted. "But I confess, looking at our children, at the strength Ivy remarked upon even at their birth, I find myself less skeptical than I might once have been. Whatever the truth of this prophecy, Damien, I care more about what it might mean for their safety than for any grand destiny it might promise." "As do I," Damien agreed. "If word spreads that our children carry the power to end generations of conflict, I fear some among my council, and certainly among those who still resent the old wars, may see them as either weapons to be claimed, or threats to be eliminated, before they can fulfill whatever destiny the prophecy describes." The following days passed with careful, quiet vigilance, as Damien worked to control the spread of information regarding the prophecy, while simultaneously strengthening the guard around the forest cabin, unwilling to leave anything to chance, as the full moon drew steadily closer. Victor predictably learned of the scholar's visit within days, his network of informants throughout the palace proving as thorough as ever, and used the news to renew his arguments before the council, framing the prophecy not as cause for hope, but as further evidence of the danger the twins represented. "A power capable of ending generations of conflict," Victor argued before the assembled council, "is equally a power capable of being turned against us, should circumstances or loyalties ever shift. I do not dispute the prophecy's existence, but I question whether we are wise to celebrate what we do not yet fully understand." Lord Edmund, for his part, grew increasingly firm in his support of Damien's position as the days passed, having spent considerable time reviewing Marcus's ancient texts himself, and finding, in their careful, detailed accounts, a compelling case for hope rather than fear. "We have spent generations trapped in a cycle of conflict that has cost this pack more than any council seems willing to fully acknowledge," he said, during one particularly tense session. "If these children truly carry the power to end that cycle, I would count it a blessing beyond measure, not a threat to be managed through fear and suspicion." As the 11th day approached, tension throughout the palace grew palpable, servants and counselors alike aware that something significant approached, even those who remained skeptical of old prophecies sensing the weight of anticipation building with each passing hour. Damien divided his time between palace duties and the forest cabin, determined to be present with Elena and their children when the full moon finally arrived, regardless of whatever political consequences his continued absence from the palace might invite. On the 10th night, as Elena settled her children for sleep, she found herself studying their peaceful faces with a mixture of hope and quiet apprehension, wondering what the following evening might truly bring, and praying, silently, that whatever destiny awaited Nathaniel and Rosalind, it would not come at the cost of the simple, precious childhood she still wished, more than anything, to provide for them. That same night, in a quiet corner of the palace, far from the council chambers, Victor met with two junior advisors he had cultivated as allies over the preceding weeks, their expressions grim in the flickering candlelight of his private study. "The full moon arrives tomorrow," Victor said, his voice low and deliberate. "If the prophecy proves true, if these children truly display some unmistakable sign of power before the entire pack, our window to act with any subtlety will close permanently. Once the pack witnesses such a display, no council, however skeptical, will be able to argue against their legitimacy." "What do you propose?" one of the advisors asked, his voice carrying a nervous edge that suggested he had not fully anticipated where this conversation might lead. "Nothing drastic," Victor said, though something in his tone suggested otherwise despite his careful choice of words. "Only that we ensure certain complications arise before the moon reaches its peak. A delay in the guard's rotation near the cabin, a moment of confusion that might allow circumstances to unfold differently than the king anticipates. I do not ask either of you to act directly against the children. I ask only that you help create conditions where the prophecy's fulfillment might be quietly prevented, or at least postponed until this council has had proper opportunity to prepare for its implications." The advisors exchanged uneasy glances, clearly troubled by the direction of Victor's plotting, but neither voiced open objection, their loyalty to Victor's patronage outweighing, for now, whatever moral hesitation they might privately harbor. Victor, watching their reluctant agreement settle into place, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, already calculating how best to position his allies for the following evening's events. He did not know, as he finalized his quiet scheme, that Caleb had positioned a trusted informant among the palace staff, specifically to watch for exactly this kind of maneuvering, having grown suspicious of Victor's continued private meetings in the days following Marcus's revelation. Word of the conversation reached Caleb before the candles in Victor's study had even burned low, and he wasted no time carrying the warning directly to Damien. "Victor intends to interfere somehow, tomorrow night," Caleb reported, finding Damien still awake in his study, reviewing Marcus's ancient texts by lamplight. "My informant could not say precisely what he plans, only that he spoke of complications near the cabin, of confusion among the guards' rotation." Damien's expression hardened, old fury rising at the thought of anyone threatening his family on the very night that might finally reveal their true, extraordinary destiny. "Then we will ensure Victor's schemes find no purchase," he said. "Double the guard rotation at the cabin. Place only wolves whose loyalty is beyond any question, and ensure Victor and his allies remain occupied here at the palace, far from any opportunity to interfere." "And what of the full moon gathering itself?" Caleb asked. "If the prophecy proves true, and word spreads as quickly as I suspect it will, the entire pack may soon converge on the cabin, eager to witness whatever sign the children might display." Damien considered this carefully. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, an idea forming even as he spoke it aloud, "it is time we stop trying to hide Elena and our children away entirely. If destiny intends to reveal itself tomorrow night, let it reveal itself openly, before the pack, rather than in careful secrecy that only fuels suspicion and rumor. I will not give Victor the advantage of chaos and confusion. I will give the pack truth, delivered with confidence rather than fear." The decision, once made, brought with it a strange, settling calm, as though weeks of careful, guarded maneuvering had finally given way to something simpler and more honest. Damien spent the remainder of that night finalizing preparations, ensuring the cabin's guard remained beyond reproach, and sending careful word ahead to Elena regarding his intention to invite select, trusted members of the pack to witness whatever the following evening might bring, rather than continue hiding their family away from a destiny that seemed, increasingly, impossible to contain. The full moon rose slowly over the forest clearing, its silver light spilling across the small gathering that had assembled at Damien's invitation, a careful selection of trusted pack members, standing at a respectful distance from the cabin, their expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to genuine hope. Elena stood near the cabin's entrance, Nathaniel cradled against her shoulder, while Damien held Rosalind, both children awake and alert despite the late hour, their amber eyes reflecting the moonlight, with an intensity that seemed, even before anything extraordinary occurred, somehow beyond the ordinary. "Are you ready?" Damien asked quietly, glancing toward Elena as the moon climbed higher, its light growing steadily more intense. "I do not know that anyone could truly be ready for whatever tonight holds," Elena admitted, though her voice carried steady resolve despite the uncertainty of the moment. "But I am ready to face it, whatever it brings, with you beside me." Among the gathered crowd, Lord Edmund stood near the front, his weathered face carrying an expression of quiet anticipation, while Caleb remained close to Damien's side, watchful and alert for any sign of the interference Victor had quietly plotted. Victor himself had been carefully, deliberately delayed at the palace through a series of urgent, fabricated matters that Caleb had arranged with quiet efficiency, ensuring the council member found himself unable to reach the cabin before the crucial hour arrived, his junior allies similarly occupied with tasks that kept them far from any opportunity to interfere. As the moon reached its zenith, a strange, electric stillness settled over the clearing, the usual sounds of the forest, birds and insects and rustling leaves, falling silent as though the entire natural world had paused to witness whatever was about to unfold. Elena felt it first, a tingling awareness moving through her body, distinct from anything she had experienced before, and glancing down, she saw that Nathaniel had gone very still in her arms, his small face turned upward toward the moon, with an intensity that seemed impossible for a child not yet a month old. "Damien," she whispered, "look." Rosalind, too, had turned her gaze toward the moon, her small body tensing with the same strange, focused energy that had overtaken her brother. The gathered crowd noticed the shift as well, murmurs rippling through the assembled wolves as they watched the twins' unusual stillness, their attention fixed entirely on the silver light overhead. Then, without warning, both children opened their mouths, and a sound emerged, unlike anything Elena or Damien, or indeed anyone gathered in that clearing, had ever heard before. It began as a thin, high note, the kind of sound one might expect from any newborn's cry, but it grew, swiftly and impossibly, into something far more powerful, a howl that seemed to rise not merely from two small sets of lungs, but from somewhere deeper, older, connected to the very land itself. The sound rolled outward from the clearing in waves, and Elena felt it move through her own body, a resonance that seemed to settle into her bones, ancient and undeniable. Around them, several of the gathered wolves dropped instinctively to their knees, some overcome by an emotion they could not fully name, others simply unable to remain standing beneath the weight of a sound that carried such unmistakable, primal power. Lord Edmund, standing near the front of the gathering, felt tears gather in his eyes as the howl washed over him, memories of decades spent watching this pack struggle beneath the weight of old conflicts and unresolved grief rising unbidden within his chest. He thought of Damien's mother, gentle and wise, and dismissed too often by counselors who valued only harsh strength, and felt, in this moment, a profound sense that her legacy had finally found its true expression in the two small children, whose combined voices now echoed across the entire territory. The howl continued for what felt like an eternity, though Elena would later realize it had lasted only a handful of minutes, before gradually softening, fading back into the ordinary cries of two exhausted newborns finally settling back into the ordinary rhythms of infancy. Silence returned to the clearing, profound and heavy with the weight of what everyone present had just witnessed. "They heard it," Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying a note of wonder as he looked toward the distant tree line, where more figures had begun emerging from the forest paths, drawn by a sound that had apparently carried far beyond the immediate clearing, reaching wolves throughout the entire territory, regardless of the distance that separated them from the cabin. "Every wolf within our borders must have felt that, Damien. I do not believe a single member of this pack could have slept through what just occurred." Indeed, over the following hour, as word spread with impossible speed through the surrounding forest and beyond, more and more pack members arrived at the clearing, drawn by the same powerful, unmistakable pull that had brought the original gathered crowd to their knees. They came not with weapons or suspicion, but with expressions of awe and reverence, many instinctively lowering themselves before Elena and Damien, and especially before the two small children who had, in the space of a few remarkable minutes, transformed from uncertain, potentially dangerous complications into something the entire pack now recognized as genuinely extraordinary. Elena, watching wolf after wolf kneel before her children, felt an overwhelming mixture of emotions, pride and protective fierceness mingling with a lingering unease at the sheer scale of what had just been revealed. "This changes everything," she said quietly to Damien, as the crowd continued to grow around them. "There will be no more hiding them away, no more careful, quiet arrangements at forest cabins far from public attention." "No," Damien agreed, his gaze moving across the gathered, reverent faces of his pack. "There will not. But Elena, look at them. Look at how our people respond, not with fear or suspicion, but with hope, genuine hope for an end to conflicts that have burdened this territory for generations. Whatever challenges await us now, I do not believe we face them alone any longer." Amid the swelling crowd, however, not every arrival came with peaceful intent. One of Victor's junior allies, a wolf named Gareth who had grown increasingly desperate as the prophecy's fulfillment threatened to undo months of careful scheming, slipped through the press of kneeling bodies with a single, reckless purpose in mind. He had convinced himself, in the frantic hours leading up to the full moon, that if the children could somehow be removed from the clearing before their power was fully witnessed by the entire pack, Victor's position might yet be salvaged, and his own standing among the council secured. Caleb noticed him first, some instinct honed through years of guarding Damien's back picking out the wrongness in Gareth's movements, the way he pushed too quickly through the crowd, his attention fixed too intently on Elena and the children, rather than on the extraordinary spectacle everyone else had gathered to witness. Caleb moved without hesitation, cutting through the crowd at an angle that placed him directly in Gareth's path, just as the other wolf reached the inner circle surrounding Elena and Damien. "That is far enough," Caleb said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable warning, as he planted himself firmly between Gareth and the small family. Gareth's eyes darted nervously between Caleb and the children, his resolve visibly wavering under the weight of what he had set out to do. "Step aside," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "This does not concern you." "Everything concerning the king's family concerns me," Caleb said, his stance shifting into something more clearly defensive, ready to act, should Gareth make any further move forward. "Whatever Victor has promised you, whatever fear has driven you to this reckless choice, I would urge you to consider carefully what happens next, surrounded as you are by hundreds of witnesses who would not hesitate to defend their king's children." Gareth's gaze swept the crowd, and for the first time, real fear registered on his face, as he seemed to fully grasp the impossibility of his position, surrounded on every side by wolves, whose reverence for the twins had already hardened into fierce, protective loyalty. Several nearby pack members had already turned at the sound of the confrontation, their expressions shifting rapidly from wonder to alertness as they recognized the danger in Gareth's tense posture. "I meant no harm," Gareth said quickly, backing away with his hands raised. Whatever courage had driven him this far, finally deserting him entirely. "I only wish to see them more closely." "Then you will see them from where you now stand," Caleb said, not moving from his protective position. "And you will remember, when you report back to whoever sent you, exactly how swiftly this pack rallies to protect what it has just witnessed." Gareth retreated quickly into the crowd, disappearing among the press of bodies before Caleb could decide whether further action was warranted, and though Damien, alerted by the brief commotion, glanced over with sharp concern, Caleb simply shook his head, indicating the moment had passed without lasting harm. Elena, who had felt her own protective instincts flare violently at the sense of danger, however brief, pulled Nathaniel more tightly against her chest, scanning the crowd with wary eyes until she was certain no further threat remained. "What happened?" Damien asked quietly, moving closer, Rosalind still cradled securely in his arms. "A reminder," Caleb said grimly, "that not everyone within our own walls has yet accepted what tonight has revealed. I will speak with you further once the crowd has dispersed, but for now, know that our children remain safe, and that this pack's loyalty, as tonight has shown beyond any doubt, will not easily be turned against them." Damien's expression hardened briefly, old protective fury flashing behind his eyes, before he forced himself to focus once more on the far greater truth unfolding around them. the overwhelming, reverent support of hundreds of pack members, far outweighing the reckless desperation of a single frightened man. Still, the brief scare left both Elena and Damien acutely aware that whatever peace tonight's revelation might bring, the road ahead would not be entirely free of those unwilling to accept it. It was at this moment, as the crowd continued to swell, and the weight of what had transpired settled fully over the clearing, that Victor finally arrived, having broken free of the delays Caleb had arranged, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of shock and calculation as he took in the scene before him. Hundreds of pack members, kneeling in reverent silence, before a king and his mate and their two extraordinary children. He said nothing at first, simply standing at the edge of the crowd, watching the unmistakable evidence of the prophecy's fulfillment play out before him, in a manner that no amount of political maneuvering could now hope to undo or reframe. Whatever arguments he had prepared, whatever schemes he had quietly cultivated among his allies, all of it withered in the face of what the entire pack had just witnessed with their own eyes and felt in their own bones. Lord Edmund noticed Victor's arrival and made his way through the crowd toward him, his expression carrying none of the earlier tension that had characterized so many of their previous disagreements. "It is done, Victor," he said quietly. "Whatever concerns you have carried, whatever fears have driven your opposition these past months, I believe tonight has answered them more definitively than either of us could have argued in any council chamber." Victor's jaw tightened, old pride warring visibly with the undeniable evidence before him. "I acted only out of concern for this kingdom's stability," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than it once had. "I do not doubt your intentions were genuine, even where I disagreed with your conclusions," Lord Edmund said, not unkindly. "But Victor, look around you. Look at how our people respond to what they have witnessed tonight. This is not a kingdom torn apart by the arrival of these children. This is a kingdom finding, perhaps for the first time in generations, genuine reason for hope. I would counsel you to consider carefully how you wish to be remembered in the story that will surely be told of this night, generations from now." Victor said nothing further, simply watching in tense, thoughtful silence as the crowd continued its reverent observance, some among the older wolves beginning to speak in hushed, wondering tones of the old curse that had plagued their bloodline for so many generations, and of the possibility, now seemingly within reach, that it might finally, truly be broken. As the night wore on and the crowd gradually began to disperse, wolves returning to their homes with wonder still evident in their expressions, Elena and Damien remained at the cabin, their children finally settling into peaceful sleep after the extraordinary events of the evening. Elena looked down at Nathaniel and Rosalind, their small chests rising and falling in the gentle rhythm of ordinary infant sleep, seemingly unaware, in their innocence, of the profound significance the pack had just witnessed in their brief, powerful howl. "They are still just children," she said softly, half to herself, half to Damien, who stood close beside her, watching their sleeping family, with an expression of quiet, overwhelming love. "Whatever destiny the prophecy suggests, whatever power they carry, they are still my children, and I will not allow anyone, prophecy or counsel or ancient curse, to forget that they deserve, more than anything, simply to be loved and protected as any child would." "They will be," Damien said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "I promise you that, Elena, with everything I am, whatever comes next, whatever challenges this prophecy might yet bring, we face them together, as a true family, openly and without fear." Elena leaned into him then, allowing herself, for the first time since her capture so many months before, to fully release the careful guard she had maintained through every difficult trial that had brought her to this moment. Above the cabin, the full moon continued its slow arc across the sky, its silver light bathing the small, extraordinary family in a glow that seemed, to those who witnessed it, like nothing less than destiny finally, truly beginning to unfold. 3 days after the full moon, Damien called a formal gathering of the entire council, along with every senior pack member willing to attend, filling the great hall of the palace to a capacity it had not seen in generations. Elena stood beside him at the front of the hall, Nathaniel and Rosalind held securely in the arms of Clara and Ivy respectively, both women having earned that trusted position through months of quiet loyalty and care. Damien surveyed the assembled crowd for a long moment before speaking, his posture carrying none of the guarded distance that had once defined nearly every public appearance throughout his reign. 3 nights ago, he began, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, this pack witnessed something none of us will soon forget. My children, born of a bond I once foolishly believed to be a weakness rather than the greatest strength I have ever known, revealed a truth that ancient prophecy long promised but few among us truly believed we would live to see. He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd, finding Lord Edmund near the front, then Victor standing somewhat apart, his expression carefully guarded. I stand before you today not merely to acknowledge that truth, Damien continued, but to correct a wrong I allowed to persist for far too long. Driven by fear, I mistook for strength, and by pride, I mistook for wisdom. He turned then, fully facing Elena, and knelt before her, a gesture so unexpected that a collective gasp moved through the assembled crowd. Elena, he said, his voice rough with genuine emotion, I imprisoned you the day fate bonded us together, treating the greatest gift I have ever been given, as though it were instead my greatest threat. I allowed my own fear to cost you months of unnecessary suffering, months you should never have had to endure. I cannot undo that wrong, but I can, before this entire pack, name you what you have always deserved to be named, my true queen, my equal in every sense, and the mother of the children who have already proven themselves capable of healing wounds this kingdom has carried for generations. Elena felt tears gather in her eyes as she looked down at him, months of hard-won trust and healing, culminating in this single, powerful moment of public acknowledgement. Rise, Damien, she said softly, extending her hand to help him to his feet. I do not need you kneeling before me to know the truth of what you feel, but I thank you, before this pack, for finally having the courage to say it aloud. Damien rose, and turning back to face the assembled crowd, continued, his voice gaining strength and certainty with each word. There are those among my own council who conspired against my family in the days and weeks leading up to this revelation, he said, his gaze settling deliberately on Victor, who stood rigid amid the crowd, who sought to eliminate my children's claim to this throne through quiet manipulation, and who, on the very night our children revealed their true nature to this entire pack, attempted to interfere through means that could have brought genuine harm to 2 innocent lives. A murmur of shock rippled through the hall, many pack members turning to look toward Victor, with expressions ranging from surprise to open anger. Victor's face had gone pale, understanding dawning that whatever careful political calculations had guided his opposition, they now stood exposed before the very audience whose support he had once hoped to leverage against Damien's growing conviction. I do not believe in cruelty for its own sake, Damien continued, and I recognize that fear, however misguided, often drives even good intentions toward troubling conclusions. Victor, you have served this council with genuine dedication for many years, even where I have disagreed with your judgment. I will not banish you from this pack, nor strip you of the position you have earned through years of service, but I require, effective immediately, your resignation from this council, and your solemn oath, witnessed by every wolf in this hall, that you will never again act against my family, through subterfuge or manipulation. Victor stood in tense, humiliated silence for a long moment, before finally, stiffly, nodding his agreement, understanding that whatever alternative might exist, carried far greater consequences than the mercy Damien had chosen to extend. I accept these terms, he said quietly, and I offer my genuine, if belated respect to the Queen, and to the children, whose destiny I so gravely misjudged. Lord Edmund, watching this exchange with quiet approval, stepped forward once Victor had retreated back into the crowd, his weathered face carrying an expression of profound satisfaction. My king, he said, on behalf of this council, and I believe on behalf of this entire pack, I wish to formally welcome Queen Elena, and Prince Nathaniel, and Princess Rosalind, into the full protection and honor of the Blackthorn throne. Whatever old conflicts once divided our peoples, I believe this pack now stands ready to embrace the future these remarkable children represent. The hall erupted into sound then, cheers and howls of celebration replacing the earlier tension, and Elena found herself surrounded by pack members eager to offer their genuine congratulations and reverent well wishes, a stark contrast to the cold suspicion that had greeted her arrival so many months before. She caught Damien's eye across the crowd, and the warmth she saw reflected there, undisguised and unguarded, told her more clearly than any words could have that the man before her now bore little resemblance to the cold, fearful king who had once locked her away in a stone tower. In the weeks that followed, life within the palace transformed gradually, but unmistakably. Elena took her place as queen, her voice carrying genuine weight within council discussions, her perspective, shaped by hardship and resilience, proving invaluable in matters both large and small. Nathaniel and Rosalind grew steadily, their extraordinary birth gradually settling into the comfortable rhythms of ordinary childhood, adored by a pack that had come to see them not merely as symbols of prophecy, but as beloved children deserving of genuine warmth and protection. Word of the reconciliation between the two former warring bloodlines spread beyond Blackthorn territory as well, reaching what remained of Elena's original pack, scattered survivors who had endured difficult months following their defeat. Damien, honoring the spirit of the prophecy that had transformed his family's fate, extended formal invitations for peaceful negotiation, working alongside Elena to forge agreements that would, over the following years, gradually heal wounds that had festered across 3 generations of conflict. On a quiet evening some months after the full moon revelation, Elena stood once again by a window, though this one carried no iron bars, no locked door waiting to seal her away from freedom. She watched Damien in the courtyard below, laughing as he chased Nathaniel across the grass, while Rosalind toddled unsteadily nearby, under Clara's watchful eye, the image so far removed from the cold, guarded king, who had once ordered her imprisonment, that she sometimes still found herself marveling at the transformation. "You seem thoughtful," Ivy observed, joining her at the window, having become a permanent fixture within the palace, her healing skills too valuable to release back to her quiet forest practice. "I am simply grateful," Elena said, watching her family with a warmth that had once seemed impossible, given the circumstances of their beginning. "I never imagined, standing in that war camp so many months ago, chained and afraid, that I would one day stand here, watching my children play freely, in a courtyard I once feared I would never leave." "Fate has strange ways of finding its path," Ivy said, "even through the most unlikely and difficult circumstances." Elena nodded, her gaze returning to the courtyard below, where Damien had scooped Nathaniel into his arms, spinning him gently, while the boy's laughter carried up through the open window, pure and unburdened by any weight of prophecy or ancient conflict. Whatever destiny had once seemed to demand of her children, Elena understood now that their true legacy would not be measured merely in prophecies fulfilled or curses broken, but in the simple, precious, ordinary joy of a family, finally, truly free to love without fear. As the sun began to set over the Blackthorn territory, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Damien looked up toward the window where Elena stood watching, and smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that would once have seemed impossible from the cruel king who had first locked her away. Elena smiled back, feeling the pull of the bond that had once felt like a curse now settle warmly into place, as exactly what it had always truly been meant to be. Not a weakness to be feared, but the greatest strength either of them had ever known. Their story, born from conflict and cruelty, had transformed, against every early expectation, into something neither of them could have imagined during those first difficult weeks of imprisonment and uncertainty. A kingdom healed, a prophecy fulfilled, and a family forged through hardship into something unbreakable, ready to guide the Blackthorn pack into a future defined not by old fears and ancient grudges, but by the same fierce, unconditional love that had carried Elena through every trial since the day fate first bound her to a cruel king, who would, in time, become the truest partner she had ever known. Later that evening, once the children had been settled into sleep and the palace had quieted into its familiar nighttime rhythms, Damien found Elena on the small balcony adjoining their shared chambers, gazing out over the territory that stretched, peaceful and moonlit, toward the horizon. "I have been thinking," he said, coming to stand beside her, "about everything that brought us to this moment. The war, your capture, the tower, all of it. I used to believe that strength meant never allowing myself to need anyone, never allowing anyone close enough to become a vulnerability. I understand now how wrong I was. We were both shaped by fear, in different ways," Elena said, leaning into him as his arms settled naturally around her shoulders. "I feared trusting you, and you feared trusting anything you could not fully control. It has taken both of us time to learn that real strength looks different than either of us once believed. I am grateful, every day, that you did not give up on the possibility of something better, even when I gave you every reason to." Damien said quietly. Whatever I have become, Elena, I owe a great deal of it to your patience, and to your refusal to accept anything less than genuine honesty between us. Elena turned to face him fully, searching his face in the soft moonlight, finding nothing there but open, unguarded love. We built this together, she said. Whatever comes next, whatever challenges this kingdom still faces, I believe we are ready to face them, as true partners, exactly as we should have been from the very beginning. Below them, the palace grounds lay quiet and still, the twins sleeping peacefully in the nursery, the pack settling into a hopeful future that none of them, even a year before, could have fully imagined. Above, the moon continued its steady path across the sky, silent witness to a story that had begun in chains and cruelty, and had found, against every early expectation, its true ending in freedom, healing, and love.